And so, in the quiet haze of a Carson City morning, where the sun rose slowly over the Nevada territory, casting a pale golden light across the dusty streets and adobe buildings that squatted low under the weight of the desert's endless sky, Gideon Holt, a man whose broad shoulders and calloused hands still bore the marks of 30 years hammering iron in a blacksmith's forge, sat on a weathered bench outside the post office, his eyes squinting against the glare as he held a plain leather satchel, its stitching frayed but sturdy, handed to him by a fidgety clerk who muttered instructions to deliver it to a rancher named Amos Tate in the far-off settlement of Dry Creek, a journey of 5 days across the vast and unforgiving desert, where the air carried the sharp scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of alkali dust, and Gideon, his gray hair tucked under a battered Stetson, its brim curled from years of sun and sweat, rose slowly, his knees creaking like the bellows he once worked, and he crossed the street to where his horse, a chestnut mare named Bess, stood tethered to a post, her tail flicking lazily at the flies that buzzed in the warming air, and he checked her saddle, running his fingers over the leather, worn smooth by countless rides, ensuring the cinch was tight, the stirrups even, the bedroll tied securely behind, and he packed the satchel carefully into a saddlebag, alongside a canteen of water, a sack of hardtack, and a small tin of coffee, each item placed with the deliberate care of a man who knew the desert's indifference to the unprepared, and he patted Bess's neck, feeling the warmth of her coat, the faint pulse of life beneath, and he murmured softly to her, though the words were more habit than meaning, lost to the morning breeze, and the satchel, now nestled among his gear, seemed to carry a quiet weight, not of heft but of purpose, though Gideon, a man grounded in the practical rhythms of hammer and anvil, dismissed such thoughts as the wanderings of a tired mind, and he mounted Bess, the saddle groaning under his weight, the leather creaking like an old door, and he turned her head toward the open trail, where the path stretched out from Carson City, a faint line of dust winding through clumps of sagebrush and greasewood, their leaves dull green against the red-brown earth, and the desert lay before him, vast and still, its silence broken only by the steady clop of Bess's hooves, the soft jingle of his spurs, the faint rustle of wind that stirred the sand and carried the scent of dry stone, and Gideon rode on, his thoughts drifting to the days when his forge glowed red, the clang of iron filling the air, the faces of men who brought horses to be shod, now faded like the trails he once followed, and the sun climbed higher, warming his back, the sky a pale blue that seemed to stretch forever, and he passed a lone Joshua tree, its twisted arms reaching upward as if pleading with the heavens for rain that never came, and he decided to rest there, dismounting with a slow, practiced ease, loosening Bess's girth, letting her graze on the sparse grass that clung to the desert's edge, and he sat against the tree, its bark rough against his back, and sipped from his canteen, the water tepid but welcome, and he chewed a piece of hardtack, its dryness crumbling in his mouth, and he gazed out at the desert, where heat shimmered on the horizon, bending the light into mirages that danced and faded, and he wondered, as the sun beat down and the flies droned, what lay within the satchel, perhaps papers or coins or something stranger still, though the clerk had offered no clues and Gideon, never one to pry, had simply nodded and taken the job, for work was work, and the promise of a few dollars in Dry Creek was reason enough to keep moving, and so he rose, dusting off his trousers, checking Bess's hooves for stones, tightening the saddle once more, and he mounted again, the desert stretching endlessly before him, a sea of sand and shadow that seemed to swallow time itself, and he rode on, the rhythm of Bess's steps lulling his mind, the world narrowing to the trail, the heat, the creak of leather, and the satchel, tucked safely in its place, carried him forward into the vast and unchanging desert. And so Gideon Holt rode on, the Nevada desert unfolding before him like an endless tapestry of sand and sagebrush, where the sun climbed higher in a sky so vast and pale it seemed to swallow the world, its heat pressing down on his shoulders as Bess, his chestnut mare, plodded along the faint trail, her hooves stirring small clouds of dust that hung in the still air, carrying the dry, bitter scent of alkali and creosote, and the horizon shimmered with mirages that danced and faded, teasing the eye with promises of water that were never there, and Gideon, his Stetson tilted low to shade his weathered face, let his thoughts drift to the days when his blacksmith's hammer rang against iron, shaping shoes for horses that carried men to places he'd never seen, and the satchel, tucked in his saddlebag, bumped gently against Bess's flank, its contents a mystery he did not dwell on, for Gideon was a man of simple purpose, content to let the trail lead where it would, and as the day wore on, the heat grew heavy, the air thick with the hum of flies and the distant cry of a hawk circling above, and he guided Bess toward a cluster of rocks, their surfaces baked smooth by years of sun, and he dismounted, the saddle creaking as he slid to the ground, his boots crunching on the gravelly earth, and he loosened Bess's girth, letting her shake her head and snort, her coat damp with sweat, and he led her to a patch of shade, where he spread his bedroll, its canvas worn thin from countless nights under the stars, and he sat, knees drawn up, and sipped from his canteen, the water warm and tasting faintly of metal, and he chewed a piece of hardtack, its dryness crumbling in his mouth, forcing him to swallow slowly, and he gazed out at the desert, where the sand stretched endlessly, broken only by clumps of greasewood and the occasional yucca, its spiky leaves trembling in the faint breeze, and he checked the satchel, ensuring it was secure, its leather warm from the sun, and he wondered briefly what Amos Tate, the rancher in Dry Creek, might want with it, though he pushed the thought aside, for curiosity was a luxury he seldom afforded, and as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, he decided to make camp, gathering twigs and dried grass to build a small fire, its flames flickering weakly against the gathering dusk, and he boiled water in a battered tin pot, tossing in a pinch of coffee grounds, the aroma sharp and familiar, and he sat by the fire, the desert night closing in, the air cooling as stars pricked through the velvet sky, one by one, and he lay back on his bedroll, the ground hard beneath him, the fire's warmth fading as the coals glowed red, and he listened to the desert silence, broken only by the soft snort of Bess and the distant howl of a coyote, and sleep came slowly, his thoughts drifting to the forge, the heat of the coals, the weight of the hammer in his hand, and he woke to the gray light of dawn. The desert unchanged, the satchel still safe, and he rose, stretching his stiff limbs, and he fed Bess a handful of grain from his pack, watching her chew contentedly, and he brewed more coffee, sipping it slowly as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the sand, and he packed his gear, checking the saddle, the cinch, the satchel, each motion deliberate, as if the desert demanded such care. And he mounted Bess, the trail stretching ahead, the air already warming, and he rode on, the second day much like the first, the landscape unyielding, the heat relentless, the trail winding through low hills dusted with sagebrush, and he passed a dry creek bed, its banks cracked and empty, and he dismounted to check for water, finding only dust, and he led Bess on, his canteen lighter now, though he rationed each sip, and as the afternoon wore on, a faint rattle broke the silence, and Gideon froze, his eyes scanning the ground, where a rattlesnake lay coiled near a rock, its scales blending with the earth, its tongue flickering, and he stood still, his heart steady, for he knew the desert's creatures preferred to be left alone, and he spoke softly to Bess, calming her as she snorted, and he stepped back slowly, guiding her away, the snake unmoving, its rattle fading as they retreated, and Gideon, relieved but unshaken, checked his gear once more, ensuring the satchel was secure, and he mounted again, the trail leading onward, the desert vast and indifferent, and he thought of the men he'd known in his blacksmith days, their faces blurred by time, their stories lost to the wind, and the sun sank lower, the sky turning to gold, and he found another cluster of rocks, dismounting to make camp, repeating the ritual of the previous night, the fire, the coffee, the hardtack, the satchel placed beside him, and he lay under the stars, their light cold and distant, and he wondered as sleep crept closer what lay ahead in Dry Creek, though he suspected it would be as simple as the trail itself, and the desert night enveloped him, its silence a blanket, its stillness a promise of rest. And so Gideon Holt rode on, the Nevada desert stretching before him like an unending sea of sand and sagebrush, where the sun rose on the third day, its light harsh and unyielding, bathing the world in a golden haze that shimmered across the dunes, and Bess, his chestnut mare, plodded steadily, her hooves kicking up small puffs of dust that lingered in the still air, carrying the faint, bitter scent of alkali and the dry rustle of tumbleweeds that rolled lazily across the trail. And Gideon, his Stetson pulled low to shield his eyes, felt the heat settle into his bones, his thoughts drifting to the forge he once tended, the glow of hot iron, the rhythm of his hammer shaping metal into something useful, and the satchel, tucked safely in his saddlebag, bumped softly against Bess's flank, its leather warmed by the sun, its contents still a mystery he did not ponder deeply, for Gideon was a man who let the trail dictate his worries, and as the morning stretched on, the desert remained unchanging, its silence broken only by the steady clop of Bess's hooves, the soft creak of the saddle, the occasional buzz of a fly that circled and vanished. And he sipped from his canteen, the water now low, its taste flat and warm, and he rationed it carefully, knowing the next waterhole was uncertain, and he passed a cluster of yuccas, their spiky leaves trembling in the faint breeze, and he scanned the horizon, where heat mirages danced like ghosts, promising rivers that were only sand. And as noon approached, the trail curved around a low hill, and Gideon spotted a wagon, its canvas cover sagging, parked beside a dry creek bed, its wheels half buried in the dust, and a man, wiry and gray-bearded, stood beside it, waving a tattered hat, his voice thin but cheerful as he called out, and Gideon reined in Bess, dismounting with a slow, deliberate motion, his boots crunching on the gravelly earth, and the man, who introduced himself as Eli the peddler, spoke in a rush of words, his hands gesturing wildly as he explained how a wheel had cracked on a rock, stranding him in the heat, and Gideon, ever practical, nodded and set to work, inspecting the wagon, its wood splintered but salvageable, and he fetched a spare spoke from Eli's cluttered load, which brimmed with pots, blankets, and bottles of dubious tonics, and together they pried the wheel free, the peddler chattering about his travels, his voice a steady drone that blended with the desert's hum, recounting tales of towns Gideon had never seen, of buyers who haggled over pennies, of nights spent under the same stars that now hung above, and Gideon listened, or half-listened, his hands busy with the repair, the wood rough under his fingers, the work familiar from years of fixing axles for stagecoaches, and the sun beat down, the air thick with dust, and they finished the repair as the afternoon waned, the wheel sturdy enough to roll again, and Eli, grateful, offered a tin cup of coffee, brewed over a small fire, its bitterness sharp but grounding, and Gideon sipped it slowly, sitting on a rock, the desert stretching endlessly around them, and Eli spoke on, his words a river of stories about lost trails and forgotten towns, and Gideon nodded, his thoughts drifting to his own past, the forge's heat, the faces of men who came and went, their horses, shod and sent on their way, and as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Eli packed his wagon, still talking, and Gideon checked Bess's saddle, ensuring the satchel was secure, its leather now dusted with sand, and he mounted again, bidding Eli a quiet farewell, the peddler's voice fading as Gideon rode on, the trail winding through low dunes, the air cooling as dusk crept closer, and he found a shallow gully, its walls offering meager shade, and he dismounted, loosening Bess's girth, letting her graze on the sparse grass that clung to the earth, and he spread his bedroll, its canvas familiar under his hands, and he built a small fire, the twigs crackling as they caught, and he boiled water in his tin pot, the coffee's aroma mingling with the desert's dry scent, and he sat, chewing hardtack, its dryness forcing him to sip water sparingly, and he gazed at the stars, now bright against the velvet sky, their light cold and distant, and he thought of Eli's stories, their details already blurring, much like his own memories of the forge, the clang of iron, the weight of the hammer, and the satchel lay beside him, its purpose unchanged, and he wondered, as sleep tugged at his mind, what Amos Tate in Dry Creek might say when he received it, though he suspected it would be simple, like the desert itself, and he lay back, the ground hard beneath him, the fire's coals glowing faintly, and the desert night wrapped him in its silence. The only sounds the soft snort of Bess and the faint rustle of wind through the sagebrush, and he drifted towards sleep, the trail stretching on in his dreams, a path of sand and shadow that led ever forward. And so Gideon Holt rode on, the Nevada desert stretching before him like an unending sea of sand and sagebrush, where the sun rose on the third day, its light harsh and unyielding, bathing the world in a golden haze that shimmered across the dunes, and Bess, his chestnut mare, plodded steadily, her hooves kicking up small puffs of dust that lingered in the still air, carrying the faint, bitter scent of alkali and the dry rustle of tumbleweeds that rolled lazily across the trail. And Gideon, his Stetson pulled low to shield his eyes, felt the heat settle into his bones, his thoughts drifting to the forge he once tended, the glow of hot iron, the rhythm of his hammer shaping metal into something useful, and the satchel, tucked safely in his saddlebag, bumped softly against Bess's flank, its leather warmed by the sun, its contents still a mystery he did not ponder deeply, for Gideon was a man who let the trail dictate his worries, and as the morning stretched on, the desert remained. Unchanging, its silence broken only by the steady clop of Bess's hooves, the soft creak of the saddle, the occasional buzz of a fly that circled and vanished, and he sipped from his canteen, the water now low, its taste flat and warm, and he rationed it carefully, knowing the next waterhole was uncertain, and he passed a cluster of yuccas, their spiky leaves trembling in the faint breeze, and he scanned the horizon, where heat mirages danced like ghosts, promising rivers that were only sand. And as noon approached, the trail curved around a low hill, and Gideon spotted a wagon, its canvas cover sagging, parked beside a dry creek bed, its wheels half buried in the dust, and a man, wiry and gray-bearded, stood beside it, waving a tattered hat, his voice thin but cheerful as he called out, and Gideon reined in Bess, dismounting with a slow, deliberate motion, his boots crunching on the gravelly earth, and the man, who introduced himself as Eli the peddler, spoke in a rush of words, his hands gesturing wildly as he explained how a wheel had cracked on a rock, stranding him in the heat, and Gideon, ever practical, nodded and set to work, inspecting the wagon, its wood splintered but salvageable, and he fetched a spare spoke from Eli's cluttered load, which brimmed with pots, blankets, and bottles of dubious tonics, and together they pried the wheel free, the peddler chattering about his travels, his voice a steady drone that blended with the desert's hum, recounting tales of towns Gideon had never seen, of buyers who haggled over pennies, of nights spent under the same stars that now hung above, and Gideon listened, or half listened, his hands busy with the repair, the wood rough under his fingers, the work familiar from years of fixing axles for stagecoaches, and the sun beat down, the air thick with dust, and they finished the repair as the afternoon waned, the wheel sturdy enough to roll again, and Eli, grateful, offered a tin cup of coffee, brewed over a small fire, its bitterness sharp but grounding, and Gideon sipped it slowly, sitting on a rock, the desert stretching endlessly around them, and Eli spoke on, his words a river of stories about lost trails and forgotten towns, and Gideon nodded, his thoughts drifting to his own past, the forge's heat, the faces of men who came and went, their horses shod and sent on their way, and as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Eli packed his wagon, still talking, and Gideon checked Bess's saddle, ensuring the satchel was secure, its leather now dusted with sand, and he mounted again, bidding Eli a quiet farewell, the peddler's voice fading as Gideon rode on, the trail winding through low dunes, the air cooling as dusk crept closer, and he found a shallow gully, its walls offering meager shade, and he dismounted, loosening Bess's girth, letting her graze on the sparse grass that clung to the earth, and he spread his bedroll, its canvas familiar under his hands, and he built a small fire, the twigs crackling as they caught, and he boiled water in his tin pot, the coffee's aroma mingling with the desert's dry scent, and he sat, chewing hardtack, its dryness forcing him to sip water sparingly, and he gazed at the stars, now bright against the velvet sky, their light cold and distant, and he thought of Eli's stories, their details already blurring, much like his own memories of the forge, the clang of iron, the weight of the hammer, and the satchel lay beside him, its purpose unchanged, and he wondered, as sleep tugged at his mind, what Amos Tate in Dry Creek might say when he received it, though he suspected it would be simple, like the desert itself, and he lay back, the ground hard beneath him, the fire's coals glowing faintly, and the desert night wrapped him in its silence. The only sounds the soft snort of Bess and the faint rustle of wind through the sagebrush, and he drifted toward sleep, the trail stretching on in his dreams, a path of sand and shadow that led ever forward. And so Gideon Holt rode on, the Nevada desert giving way to the faint outlines of Dry Creek, where the trail descended into a shallow valley, the town's adobe buildings squatting low under the relentless sun of the fifth day, their walls weathered by wind and time, and Bess, his chestnut mare, plodded wearily, her hooves stirring the dust of the main street, where a few scattered signs, a general store, a livery, a saloon, creaked in the faint breeze, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and sun, baked earth, and Gideon, his Stetson dusty and tilted low, felt the weight of the journey in his aching shoulders, his thoughts drifting to the forge he once knew, the steady rhythm of hammer on iron, now replaced by the endless trail, and the satchel, still secure in his saddlebag, bumped softly against Bess's flank, its leather scratched but intact, its contents a mystery he had carried across the desert without question. For Gideon was a man who let tasks guide his steps, and as he reined in, Bess outside the livery, dismounting with a slow, deliberate motion, his boots crunching on the gravelly street, he led her to a trough, where she drank deeply, her muzzle dripping with water that glistened in the sunlight, and he patted her neck, feeling the warmth of her coat, and he checked the satchel, ensuring it was safe, before walking toward the saloon, its batwing doors swaying slightly, the air inside heavy with the smell of whiskey and tobacco, and he stepped in, his spurs jingling. Faintly, the room dim and quiet, save for a few men hunched over tables, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats, and a bartender, wiping a glass with a rag, nodded as Gideon approached, asking for water, his voice low and hoarse from days of dust. But a man at the bar, his eyes narrowed and his hand resting on a worn pistol, mistook Gideon for another, muttering about a debt unpaid in some forgotten town, and Gideon, calm and steady, raised his hand slightly, his voice soft as he explained he was only a courier, passing through to deliver a satchel to Amos Tate, and the man, after a long, tense moment, grunted and turned away, the misunderstanding fading like dust settling after a breeze, and Gideon sipped his water, the coolness soothing his throat, and he paid with a coin from his pocket, stepping back into the sunlight, the saloon's brief tension already forgotten, and he led Bess to a hitching post, checking her saddle, her hooves, the satchel, each motion. Deliberate, as if the desert had taught him to measure every act, and he asked a passerby, an old man with a limp, where to find Amos Tate, and the man pointed to a ranch just beyond the town, a low house nestled among cottonwoods, and Gideon mounted Bess, the trail to the ranch short but dusty, the air thick with the hum of cicadas, and he passed a few scattered homes, their fences sagging, their yards dotted with dry grass, and the desert stretched beyond, its vastness unchanged, and he reached the ranch as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the sandy earth, and he dismounted, tying Bess to a post, her tail flicking lazily at flies, and he approached the house, its door weathered but sturdy, and knocked softly, the satchel in his hand, its weight familiar now, and an old man, Amos Tate, answered, his face lined like the desert itself, his eyes sharp but kind, and Gideon handed over the satchel, explaining its delivery from Carson City, and Amos nodded, opening it, to reveal a bundle of old deeds, their paper yellowed and creased, and he muttered thanks, offering Gideon a cup of coffee, which he accepted, sitting on the porch as the sky turned purple, the coffee bitter but warm, and Amos spoke briefly of the land, of years spent taming it, his voice a low drone that blended with the evening's stillness, and Gideon listened, or half-listened, his thoughts drifting to the trail, the heat, the dry well, the peddler's wagon, the homestead fence, and he sipped the coffee, its warmth grounding him, and he rose, bidding Amos a quiet farewell, leading Bess back to town, the satchel delivered, its purpose simple as he had suspected, and he found a stable for Bess, paying for her care, and he spread his bedroll in a corner of the livery, the smell of hay and leather familiar, and he lay down, the town quiet around him, the stars bright above, and he thought of the journey, its endless days, its small tasks, and he wondered, as sleep tugged at his mind, whether Dry Creek might be a place to rest, though the desert, vast and unchanging, seemed to call him still, and the night wrapped him in its silence. The only sounds the soft snort of Bess and the faint creak of the stable's timbers, and he drifted toward sleep, the trail fading into dreams of sand and shadow. And so Gideon Holt lingered in Dry Creek, the Nevada desert's vastness fading into the background as the town's quiet rhythms enveloped him, its adobe buildings glowing faintly under the morning sun, their walls worn smooth by years of wind and sand, and Bess, his chestnut mare, rested in the livery, her coat brushed clean, her hooves checked for stones, her soft snorts blending with the creak of the stable's timbers, and Gideon, his Stetson now hung on a peg, sat on a bench outside the general store, his hands resting on his knees, the ache of the trail still lingering in his bones, and he thought of the journey, the endless sands, the dry well, the peddler's wagon, the homestead fence, the satchel now delivered to Amos Tate, its bundle of old deeds a simple thing as he had suspected, and the town moved slowly around him, the clatter of a wagon wheel, the murmur of voices from the saloon, the faint clink of a hammer from a blacksmith's shop, stirring memories of his own forge, the glow of coals, the weight of the hammer in his hand, and he walked the main street, his boots scuffing the dust, passing the saloon where the brief misunderstanding had faded like a shadow, and he nodded to the old man who had pointed him to Amos Tate's ranch, the man's limp unchanged, his face creased with the desert's lines, and Gideon bought a sack of flour and a tin of coffee from the store, its shelves stocked with jars and bolts of cloth, the air heavy with the scent of molasses and leather, and he carried his purchases to the livery, checking Bess's feed, ensuring her stall was clean, and he sat there, sipping coffee brewed over a small fire, its bitterness familiar, grounding, and he gazed out at the desert beyond the town, its dunes stretching to the horizon, the heat shimmering in waves, and he wondered if Dry Creek might be a place to stay, its stillness a contrast to the trails he'd wandered, and he thought of the people he'd met, the peddlers' endless stories, the settler family's quiet struggle, Amos Tate's weathered face, and he felt a faint pull to rest, to let the desert's vastness become a memory, and the day passed slowly, the sun climbing and falling, the sky turning from blue to gold to purple, and Gideon spread his bedroll in the livery, the hay soft beneath him, the air warm with the smell of horses and dust, and he lay down, the town settling into silence, the only sounds the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. And he thought of the satchel, its delivery complete, its purpose small but certain, and he wondered, as sleep crept closer, what his own purpose might be, whether the forge or the trail or this quiet town held the answer, and the stars emerged, their light cold and distant, piercing the velvet sky. And he recalled nights on the trail, the fire's glow, the creak of the saddle, the taste of hardtack, and he felt the desert's vastness still, its silence a weight he carried, and he walked to the edge of town, where the sand met the stars, and he stood, his hands in his pockets, the breeze cool against his face, and he watched the horizon, where the desert stretched on, unchanging, eternal, and he returned to the livery, lying back on his bedroll, the ground familiar beneath him, and he thought of the men he'd known, their faces blurred by time, their horses shod and sent on their way, and he wondered if Dry Creek's blacksmith might need a hand, if his hammer might find purpose again, and the night deepened, the town's lights fading, the desert wrapping everything in its quiet embrace, and Gideon closed his eyes, the journey now a memory, its details softening like the edges of a worn photograph, and he thought of the trail, the satchel, the desert's endless song, and he drifted towards sleep, the livery's warmth surrounding him, the stars above unyielding, and the desert night stretched on, its silence a blanket, its stillness a promise of rest, and Gideon Holt, once a wanderer, now a man pausing in a small town, let the world fade, the creak of the stable, the snort of Bess, the faint hum of the desert, all blending into a dream of sand and shadow, where the trail led nowhere and everywhere, and the night carried him gently into sleep. They say the desert remembers everything, the blood, the lies, the laughter carried on wind that hasn't changed in 100 years, and out there, in that vast ocean of sand, bone, and sunburnt silence, rode a man called Elias Granger, a former Union scout turned drifter with a limp in his step and too many ghosts in his saddlebag, who had once ridden for country but now rode for reasons even he couldn't name. His eyes always fixed ahead, never behind, except in dreams when the smoke of burned villages and faces of the dead clawed their way back into memory like rattlers in a grain sack. The year was 1874 and the territories were wild with greed, guns, and grudges that hadn't died with the war. Rail lines were creeping across sacred ground, outlaws were making kings of themselves with dynamite and stolen silver, and lawmen were just killers with tin stars who prayed to whiskey more than any god. Elias had tried to escape all that once, building fences on a ranch outside Santa Fe, carving out a life with a woman named Clara who smelled of sage and spoke like thunder when she was angry. But peace was a stranger that never stayed long, and when a gang calling themselves the Thorn River Boys raised the homestead looking for Union money that never existed, killing Clara and stringing Elias from a windmill to die slow and ugly, something broke in him that never healed, and from that day forward, he stopped being a man and became something else, a reckoning wrapped in leather and dust. With a carbine he cleaned every night and a list of names scratched into the inside of his hatband, names he would whisper to himself like a prayer soaked in gunpowder. The desert knew his boots well by the time he caught up with the first one, Josiah Pike, playing poker in a saloon near Devil's Butte, too drunk to see the shadow coming behind him, and when Elias put a bullet in his skull, the bartender didn't even blink. Violence was just another form of punctuation out there, away to end a sentence written in bad decisions and worse whiskey. Over the years, the list grew shorter, but the nights grew longer, and every time Elias looked at his reflection in a basin of water or a cracked mirror, he saw less of a man and more of a shape, a creature carved by revenge and loss, until finally only one name remained. Ezekiel Marr, leader of the Thorn River Boys, now calling himself Judge Marr. In a town called Redemption Creek, where he wore fine suits, gave speeches in church halls, and hanged thieves on Sunday mornings while quoting scripture with the fervor of a man who'd forgotten what blood on his hands felt like. Elias arrived during a storm, the kind that brings lightning before thunder and turns streets to rivers of mud, and walked straight into the church where Marr was giving a sermon, raising his voice to God as Elias raised his gun to him. There was no trial, no duel, just a single shot that echoed off the stained glass and sent the congregation screaming into the rain, and Elias stood there, soaked and hollow, as the preacher bled out on the altar, his sins finally paid in full. He rode out at dawn, not looking back, just a shadow against the horizon, heading into a land where maps end and legends begin, knowing full well that peace still wouldn't come, because when you walk that long in the dark, the light stops feeling like home. And maybe that's the price a man pays for trying to set fire to the past in a world where the wind always blows it back in your face. So he rode on, past ghost towns and grave markers, with silence for company and nothing ahead but sky, dust, and the quiet truth that some stories aren't meant to end, only fade. They called him Jonah Hud, not because he was blind, but because he looked at men the way a grave does, quiet, cold, and waiting, and somewhere in the bone-dry stretch between El Paso and the Colorado border, where coyotes sang lullabies to the dead and every sunrise felt like Judgment Day, Jonah rode alone on a weathered mare named Smoke, the color of ash and just as silent, with a rifle slung low and a past no man dared ask about, because the answers had a way of bleeding into the dirt. It was 1882, and the frontier was dying a slow death under railroad spikes and eastern gold. But there were still corners of the West too wild for maps and too mean for God, and in one of those corners lay Drywater, a half-dead mining town choking on coal dust and corruption, where the sheriff was a drunk, the preacher ran a gambling hall, and a man named Ransom Lee ruled like a rattlesnake in boots. He owned the mines, the saloon, the law, and most of the graves, built on blood and backed by the barrel of his men's guns. Jonah wasn't looking for justice when he rode into town. He wasn't looking for anything except a place to disappear, maybe drink himself into silence, maybe die in a back alley and be done with it. But fate, like the desert wind, don't care what a man wants, only what he's due. And the moment he stepped off that horse and into Nellie's saloon, eyes turned, whispers followed. And someone made the mistake of thinking he was weak, old, or both. 3 men tried to take his coin, and 5 seconds later only one was still breathing, crawling across broken glass and begging for a name he never got, because Jonah didn't kill for pride, only necessity. That night, as he sat alone nursing a bottle of rye, Nellie herself, sharp-tongued, red-haired, and carrying a derringer in her garter, slid into the booth and told him about her brother, a boy of 17 strung up by Ransom's men for the crime of asking for fair pay, left hanging in the town square like a warning. Nailed to the sky, and something in Jonah's silence shifted. Not pity, not rage, just a cold remembering, like a broken watch starting to tick again. Because once, long ago, before the scars and the killing, Jonah had a brother too. He didn't say yes, didn't say anything, just stood up, left his bottle, and started walking toward the courthouse where Ransom Lee was giving orders behind a desk carved from stolen pine. What followed wasn't a shootout, wasn't a standoff, wasn't anything noble or clean, just thunder in a hallway, screams on the stairs, and the sound of boots dragging blood across polished floorboards. When it was over, Jonah walked out with a bullet in his side, 6 empty shells, and the town staring like they'd seen a ghost who brought his own storm. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't want it, just patched himself up in the barn behind Nellie's place and rode out before dawn, leaving behind only a tin star he'd taken off the corpse of the drunk sheriff, pinned to the door of the saloon like a cruel joke or a challenge. Some say he died weeks later in the mountains, bleeding into snow under a sky full of wolves. Others say he rides still, showing up in towns where justice died and fire needs to be rekindled. A shadow with hollow eyes and hands steady as judgment. Me, I don't much care which version's true, because either way, the West don't forget a man like Jonah Reed. And neither do the devils he buried 6 feet deep in places you won't find on any map. Long before the railroad tracks stitched the frontier into something tame, when the land still howled with the voices of those who bled for it, there lived a man known only as Mercer Clay, a name that drifted through saloons and campfires like a warning from the past. He wasn't a hero, not by any stretch, just a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, and walked too far into the dust to ever come back clean. A bounty hunter who didn't chase men for the money but because he believed every bullet he fired was carving some balance back into a crooked world. And in the spring of 1879, when most were planting seed and praying for rain, Mercer rode into a town called Widow's Pass, a godforsaken dot on the edge of Apache lands, where the air stank of iron and the sheriff hadn't been sober since Lincoln died. The locals eyed him like he was death itself, tall, scarred, wrapped in a duster stiff with desert grit, and carrying a pair of revolvers with notches that told stories no one dared ask about. He came looking for a man named Caleb Voss, a preacher turned outlaw who'd traded sermons for slaughter, leading a gang that raided wagon trains and burned whole settlements under the banner of some twisted gospel, and word had it he was hiding in the hills beyond Widow's Pass, living like a prophet among wolves. Mercer didn't speak much, just paid for a room with silver, drank alone in the saloon under a sky that didn't blink. And when the bartender asked what brought him here, he simply said, "Old sins," and let the silence swallow the rest. Over the next 2 days, he gathered what little he could, whispers from whores, threats from ranch hands, all pointing to a canyon deep in the South Ridge, cursed ground where bones outnumbered stones. And on the 3rd day, he rode out with no plan but a full belt of cartridges and a letter in his coat pocket, yellowed and folded 100 times, addressed to no one, signed only, "I'm sorry." The ride was hard, the wind mean, and the trail narrow enough to make a lesser man turn back, but Mercer wasn't the kind to fear dying. He feared leaving the job unfinished, and when he reached that canyon, he found Voss waiting, flanked by 6 men and a cross made of rifle barrels behind him, preaching to the sky as if God were still listening. The shootout didn't last long. Nothing worth remembering ever does. And by the time the dust settled, only Mercer stood breathing, shot through the thigh but still upright, dragging Voss to his knees, and staring into eyes that burned with madness and belief. And when Voss asked if he had come for vengeance, Mercer said no. This ain't revenge, it's removal, and put one clean shot through his heart, sending the last echo of his sins into the cliff walls. Mercer didn't return to Widow's Pass. He left the corpse for the vultures and the cross for the wind, riding into a dusk that never seemed to end, because a man like him doesn't get a final chapter, just more pages soaked in gunpowder and regret. Some say he died that winter in a blizzard near Tombstone. Others claim he lived long enough to put a bullet through the last member of Voss's gang, but the truth is buried under dust and time, like everything else out here, and the only thing that remains is his name, whispered by those who remember that even in a land built on lawlessness, there was once a man who kept count, Not for justice, not for glory, but because he believed someone had to. The sun hammered down on Rattlesnake Gulch like a blacksmith's fist, turning the main street into a shimmering ribbon of dust. Inside the Lucky Diamond saloon, the air hung thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and desperation. Sheriff Elias Thorne leaned against the bar, the polished wood smooth under his calloused fingers. His reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bottles showed a man worn thin, eyes the color of flint held deep lines, and gray peppered his once dark mustache. He wasn't drinking, just listening. Listening to the nervous chatter, the clink of glasses, the forced laughter that died too quickly. They were waiting. He was waiting. 3 days ago, Silas, the Dust Devil Rance, had ridden out of the Badlands, trailing a legend of violence as long as the shadow he cast at noon. Word spread faster than prairie fire. Rance was coming for Rattlesnake Gulch. Coming for the bank, they whispered. Coming for revenge against the town that ran his brother out years back, others murmured. Coming for Thorne himself, a few dared to say, remembering a Dusty Canyon showdown a decade past where Elias's bullet had clipped Rance's ear, letting him escape but branding him forever. Elias remembered the cold fury in Rance's eyes that day, a promise unfinished. Now, silence descended as a lone rider materialized at the end of the street, a dark silhouette against the bleached sky. No hurry, just a slow, deliberate walk. The rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth echoed like a death knell. Doors slammed shut along the boardwalk. Faces disappeared from windows. The piano inside the Lucky Diamond fell silent mid-tune. Only Thorne remained outwardly calm, pushing himself off the bar and adjusting the worn leather gun belt slung low on his hips. The familiar, heavy weight of his Colt Peacemaker was a cold comfort. He stepped out onto the sun-baked planks, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. Dust devils swirled lazily in the empty street. Rance reigned in his dusty bay about 20 paces away. He hadn't changed much, leaner, harder, eyes like chips of obsidian set in a face weathered by sun and malice. A jagged scar now traced the path Elias's bullet had taken, pulling his lip into a permanent, cruel sneer. He wore 2 guns, tied low, the handles worn shiny with use. Thorne. Rance's voice was gravel scraped over stone. Been a long time. Figured you'd be dead by now. Or running. Figured wrong, Silas, Elias replied, his voice steady despite the copper taste of fear in his mouth. His hand hovered near his holster, not touching, but ready. Town ain't yours for the talkeen. Bank's got nothing, you need that bad. Rance spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Bank? That chicken feed. He chuckled, a dry, rattlesnake sound. Nah, Sheriff. I came for you. That canyon, that clipped ear, it kept me warm on cold nights, thinking on how I'd settle it. How I'd watch the life drain out of your eyes right here in this dung-heaped town you protect. He shifted slightly in the saddle, his right hand drifting infinitesimally closer to his gun. Step into the street, old man. Let's finish it. Elias felt the eyes of the town boring into his back from behind shuttered windows. He thought of young Doc Henderson, the hopeful schoolteacher Miss Evans, old man Jenkins who'd just buried his wife. They didn't deserve the storm Silas Rance brought. A lifetime of upholding the law, of choosing order over chaos, crystallized in this moment. He wouldn't run. Couldn't. He took 1 step down off the boardwalk, then another, boots sinking slightly into the fine dust. The street felt impossibly wide, the sun blindingly bright. He stopped, 10 paces from Rance. The world narrowed to the space between them, the shimmering heat haze, the scent of horseflesh and gun oil, the terrible, focused hatred radiating from the outlaw. You don't have to do this, Silas, Elias said, a final, futile plea for reason he knew wouldn't come. Riding away ain't the same as running. It's just living. Rance's sneer widened. Only one of us walks away today, Thorne. Make your peace. His hand flashed down, a blur of practice speed. Time fractured. Elias's own draw was pure muscle memory, honed over decades but slower now, an eternity compared to Rance's viper strike. He saw the glint of Rance's barrel-clearing leather, the puff of smoke a fraction of a second before the thunderclap report shattered the stillness. Elias felt the wind of the bullet whip past his temple as he fired, his body twisting instinctively. Prep. 2 shots, impossibly loud, echoing off the false-fronted buildings. A startled whinny from Rance's horse. A gasp from somewhere unseen. Rance jerked violently in the saddle. His gun hand dropped, the weapon falling into the dust with a dull thud. He clutched his chest, crimson blossoming like a grotesque flower on his faded shirt. He looked down, then up at Elias, disbelief warring with the pain in his dark eyes. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged. He swayed, then slid sideways off his horse, landing heavily in the dirt with a puff of dust that settled slowly around him. Silence. Deafening, absolute silence. Elias stood frozen, smoke curling from his Colt's barrel, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't been fast enough to draw first, but he'd been fast enough to move, to make Rance miss, to make his own shot count. He walked forward slowly, gun still trained on the fallen man. Rance lay on his back, staring sightlessly at the merciless blue sky, the sneer finally gone, replaced by a slack emptiness. The dust devil was still. Elias holstered his gun, the click unnaturally loud. He looked down at the man he'd killed, no triumph in his heart, only a profound weariness and the sour taste of necessity. The town began to cautiously emerge, faces pale, eyes wide. Doc Henderson hurried forward, but Elias shook his head grimly. It was over. The storm had passed, leaving only dust, death, and the heavy burden of survival beneath the relentless Arizona sun. He turned away from the body, his boots scuffing the dust as he walked back towards the saloon, the weight of his star suddenly heavier than it had ever been. The law had won, but Elias Thorne felt only loss. It wasn't the fierce, cleansing downpour of the high plains, but the dreary, incessant drizzle that seemed to weep from the perpetually gray sky over Bleakwater Junction. It slicked the warped planks of the platform, dripped mournfully from the rusted tin roof of the station house, and turned the single street of the town into a sucking ribbon of mud. Inside the small station, the air hung thick with the smell of damp wool, coal smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the telegraph key. Silas Crow, station master, leaned on the counter, watching the water trail down the grimy window. His reflection was a smudged ghost, a gaunt face under a flat-capped hat, eyes the color of tarnished pewter, a thick gray mustache hiding a mouth that rarely smiled. He traced a calloused finger over a deep, knotted scar that ran from his temple down his jawline, disappearing into his collar. A souvenir from a different life, a life buried deeper than the tracks outside. 10 years ago, Silas Crow hadn't been a station master in a forgotten rain-sodden junction. He'd been known across 3 territories as Black Iron Crow, chief enforcer for the Transcontinental and Western Railroad. His job hadn't been laying track, it had been clearing the way. Clearing out squatters, breaking strikes with ruthless efficiency, silencing opposition with a reputation built on cold pragmatism and fists like sledgehammers. He'd worn the railroad's brass like armor, believing in the iron horse's manifest destiny, ignoring the human cost ground beneath its wheels. The scar was a gift from a desperate homesteader's son during the bloody Clearwater Canyon evictions, a moment where Black Iron had hesitated, just for a second, seeing the boy's terror mirroring his own long-dead conscience. That hesitation nearly cost him his life. The railroad patched him up, paid him off handsomely, and then, when the whispers of excessive force grew too loud in the newspapers back east, they pointed him towards obscurity. Bleakwater Junction, terminus of a spur line going nowhere, became his gilded cage. He'd found a grim sort of peace. He kept the trains running, the single daily mixed freight and passenger car that wheezed in and out like a tired old dog. He handled the telegraph, sorted the meager mail, and tolerated the taciturn locals. Old Man Finch, who ran the ramshackle livery stable, Mrs. Gable, who served tough stew and weak coffee at the Dripping Spur saloon, and young Tom, a wide-eyed orphan Finch had taken in, who idolized the trains and peppered Silas with endless questions he answered with gruff patience. Silas kept his head down, his past locked away like the heavy iron strongbox under the counter. The only reminder he allowed himself was a pair of worn, lead-weighted brass knuckles tucked deep in a drawer, cold and heavy as his old sins. The trouble blew in with the eastbound freight, 3 days behind schedule. 2 men disembarked, stepping onto the slick platform like wolves entering a sheep pen. The leader was Harlan Vance, tall, lean, draped in a long oilskin duster that couldn't hide the tied-down holster on his hip. His face was sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth, eyes like chips of obsidian. His companion, Bull, lived up to his name, a mountain of muscle with a flattened nose and small, piggish eyes that scanned the empty platform with casual menace. They didn't head for the saloon. They walked straight into the station house, bringing the chill damp with them. "Station master," Vance stated, his voice a dry rasp like gravel under a boot. He didn't ask, he named. Silas met his gaze, the old wariness coiling in his gut. "Vance, didn't figure to see you this far off the main line." He recognized him. Vance ran protection rackets for small mining outfits, a snake who preferred others to do his dirty work. He'd tangled with Vance's ilk before on the railroad's behalf. Vance's thin lips twitched. "Heard the fishing was good out this way." "Quiet." He leaned on the counter, his gloved fingers tapping a slow rhythm. "Real quiet. Perfect for storage. Temporary. A shipment. Needs watching. Discreet watching." Silas felt the weight of the brass knuckles in the drawer beneath the counter. He knew what shipment meant. Stolen gold, payroll, contraband. "This ain't that kind of station, Vance. We handle mail, freight manifests, passengers who miss their connections. No storage." Bull took a step forward, his bulk blocking the dim light from the door. "Boss said storage." Vance held up a hand, silencing Bull. His eyes never left Silas. "See, Crow, that's where you're mistaken. This station," he tapped the counter again, "is that kind of station. For the next week. We pay well. Very well. Enough to get you out of this rain-soaked hellhole for good." He slid a heavy leather pouch across the counter. It landed with a muffled clink of coin. Silas didn't touch it. He looked past Vance, out the window to where young Tom was trying to fix a broken hinge on the tool shed, humming tunelessly. He thought of Mrs. Gable's weary kindness, old man Finch's stubborn decency. Bringing Vance's poison here would drown them all. "Money's no good if you're dead, Vance. Or in prison. Take your business elsewhere." Vance's affable mask slipped. The cold intelligence turned predatory. "Elsewhere ain't an option. And refusal, well, that's just bad business." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I know who you are, Black Iron. I know what you did at Clearwater. How many widows and orphans you made for the railroad. How much blood your efficiency spilled. You think hiding out here washes it off?" He gestured vaguely towards the scar on Silas's face. "That's just one mark. I know men, good men, family men, who died screaming your name. Men like my brother, Jib." Silas froze. Jib Vance, the homesteader's son. The boy whose terrified eyes had mirrored his own flicker of doubt before the axe handle connected. The boy whose blow had given him the scar. He hadn't known the name. The railroad hadn't cared. Vance saw the recognition flicker. "Yeah, little Jeb. You broke him, Crow. Broke my ma. Now." He smiled, a death-as-head grin. "You'll do this little job. Or I won't just kill you. I'll burn this miserable town to the ground, starting with that old fool Finch and his brat out there. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who brought the fire down. Black Iron Crow, back for one last massacre. How's that for your retirement?" The threat hung in the damp air, thick and suffocating. The ghosts of Clearwater Canyon crowded the small station. The cries, the accusations, the weight of all those shattered lives. The brass knuckles in the drawer felt like they were burning through the wood. Black iron surged within him, the cold, brutal pragmatist whispering that compliance was survival, that the town was collateral, just like always. Save himself. Save Tom, Finch, Mrs. Gable, by damning them all to Vance's shadow. He looked at Vance's triumphant sneer, at Bull's dull anticipation of violence. He looked out the window again. Tom had stopped humming, sensing the tension, his young face pale and uncertain. Silas saw Jeb Vance's terrified eyes superimposed on Tom's. Slowly, deliberately, Silas pushed the pouch of coins back across the counter. "Get out." Vance's smile vanished. "Big mistake, old man." "Probably," Silas said, his voice low and rough as bedrock. "But it's mine to make." He didn't reach for the drawer. He reached under the counter, not for the knuckles, but for the heavy, cast-iron telegraph key weight, a solid lump of metal the size of a fist. Vance's hand blurred towards his gun. Bull roared, lunging forward like a charging bull, fists clenched. Silas moved. Not with the blinding speed of youth, but with the brutal economy of a man who knew exactly how to hurt. He sidestepped Bull's wild charge, letting the giant's momentum carry him crashing into a stack of luggage. Simultaneously, he swung the telegraph weight in a short, vicious arc. It wasn't aimed at Vance's gun hand, but lower, connecting with a sickening crack against Vance's kneecap. Vance screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, his draw forgotten as he crumpled, clutching his shattered leg. Bull, scrambling up from the scattered luggage, bellowed in rage and charged again. Silas didn't retreat. He met the charge, dropping the weight and ducking under Bull's swinging fist. He drove his own shoulder, hardened by years of railroad labor, into Bull's midsection, driving the wind out of him with a whoosh. Before Bull could recover, Silas brought his knee up sharply, connecting with the man's chin. Bull's eyes rolled back, and he crashed down like a felled oak, shaking the floorboards. Silas stood breathing heavily, the old ache in his scar flaring. Vance writhed on the floor, whimpering, his gun still holstered. Bull lay unconscious. The station was suddenly silent except for the drumming rain and Vance's ragged gasps. Silas walked to the door, ignoring the pain in his own ribs. He flung it open. Tom stood frozen outside, eyes wide as saucers. "Tom," Silas rasped. "Fetch Finch. And tell Mrs. Gable we need rope. Lots of it." He turned back. Vance looked up at him, hatred warring with pain. "You're dead, Crow. They'll come for you. They'll burn it all." Silas looked down at him, then at the unconscious Bull. He walked to the counter, opened the drawer, and took out the brass knuckles. They felt unnaturally heavy cold. He walked back to Vance and crouched beside him. Vance flinched, expecting the blow. Silas held up the knuckles, letting Vance see the worn metal, the ingrained stains that might be oil or something else. "They know where I am now, Vance," he said quietly, his voice devoid of anger, only a terrible, weary certainty. "Because of you. So you listen good. You tell them, whoever sent you, whoever wants this place, that Black Iron Crow is still here, and Bleakwater Junction is under my protection. You send men, I'll break them. You come yourself." He let the knuckles dangle inches from Vance's good eye. "I'll finish what your brother started. Now shut up, or I'll gag you with your own boot." He stood up, pocketing the cold iron. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd just torn open an old grave. The fragile piece of Bleakwater was shattered. The rain continued its dreary tattoo on the roof as Finch and a wide-eyed Tom arrived with rope. Silas watched them truss the groaning Vance and the still unconscious Bull. The ghosts of Clearwater, stirred by Vance's words, whispered in the corners. The railroad's shadow stretched long, even here. He walked to the window, looking out at the muddy street, the relentless rain washing the platform clean. It couldn't wash him clean. Black Iron was awake, and Bleakwater Junction, dripping and desolate, was now his to defend, a penance paid not in gold, but in vigilance beneath the weeping sky. The cold weight of the knuckles in his pocket felt like the only truth left in the world. They say the West was built on dust, blood, and silence, and if that's true, then no man carried more silence on his shoulders than Buck Algren, a quiet rider with a rifle longer than his patience and a stare cold enough to freeze the sweat off a gambler's brow, who drifted from county to county like a storm with no rain, leaving behind stories told in whispers and bullet holes. And in the summer of 1885, when the drought turned rivers to bone and cattle to corpses, Buck rode into a place called Gallows Rest, a forgotten town wedged between Rattlesnake Canyons and outlaw country, where the law had long since packed up and left behind nothing but cowards, grifters, and a preacher who drank more than he prayed. Folks didn't ask questions in Gallows Rest. Not since the Harlan gang took it over 2 months prior, a pack of saddle scum led by Merritt Harlan himself, a man with dead eyes and silver teeth, who called himself the judge, and handed out death sentences for sport. He owned the saloon, the general store, and the sheriff's badge, wore it like a joke pinned to his gut, and every man, woman, and child in that dust-bitten hellhole knew better than to resist, until Buck Algren came rolling down the main street, coat flapping, face unreadable, eyes scanning every window like he could see through walls and lies alike. Nobody knew what brought him, though some said he was chasing ghosts. Others claimed he used to ride with the Harlans before they went bad, but the truth was far heavier and far lonelier. 20 years ago, when Buck was still young and the war hadn't yet swallowed him whole, Merritt Harlan burned his father's ranch to the ground and strung up his brother from a cottonwood tree, calling it justice for a crime that never happened, and Buck had carried that memory like a bullet in his spine ever since, waiting for the right time to pay it back in lead and fire. He didn't come for speeches, didn't warn the townsfolk, didn't leave a note. He just rode up to the saloon, stepped inside, and stared Harlan in the eyes for the first time in 2 decades, and what passed between them wasn't words, but recognition, like 2 wolves remembering the taste of blood. Guns cleared leather fast. But Buck was faster, always had been, and within seconds, Harlan's silver teeth were scattered across the floor with the rest of him twitching in a pool of whiskey and regret. The rest of the gang came pouring in like hornets, 20 men with rifles and no brains, but Buck moved like wind through wheat, shooting, reloading, moving again, ducking behind tables, bursting through walls, his eyes never blinking, not even once, until the last body hit the floor with a final thud that seemed to shake the whole damn town awake. By the time it was over, Buck stood alone, bleeding from the ribs but unbothered, surrounded by smoke, silence, and the weight of a promise finally kept. He didn't wait for applause or thanks, didn't stick around to rebuild the law. He just holstered his iron, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and rode back into the desert where the sky is wide and the past can't quite reach you, not unless you let it. And though Gallows Rest slowly came back to life, and children eventually played where blood once pooled, they never forgot the man who came from nowhere, settled an old score with the precision of fate, and vanished into the dust, leaving behind only a trail of hoofprints and a legend too heavy to carry, because in the wild West, there ain't no heroes, just men with quiet hearts, loud guns, and stories the land keeps telling long after the riders are gone. The ghosts of Granite Springs. Dust devils danced across the sun-blasted main street of Granite Springs, a town clinging to life like a burr on a saddle blanket. Silence, thick and heavy as the desert heat, pressed down. Everyone knew why. Silas read, Harlow was back. 15 years vanished after the infamous Granite Springs bank job, a heist stained with blood, mostly innocent bystanders, including the sheriff's young wife. Red swore it was his partner, Quick Draw, Cal Riggins, who panicked and fired. Few believed the outlaw then, fewer cared now. Red rode in alone, a gaunt shadow of the brash gunslinger he'd been, the flame-colored hair that earned his name now faded to gray ash, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man chased by more than just posses. He found the town shriveled, the bank a boarded-up husk. The saloon, the Lucky Horseshoe, still stood, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Inside, the air hung stale with tobacco smoke and resentment. Conversations died as Red pushed through the batwing doors. Faces hardened, men who'd been boys when the shooting happened, women who remembered the widow's maid. Behind the bar stood Tom Henderson, once the deputy, now the sheriff, his badge dull on his worn vest. His hand hovered near his Colt. Harlow, he rasped, the name tasting like poison. Heard you was dead. Not yet, Tom, Red replied, his voice gravelly. He ordered whiskey, ignoring the hostile stares. He wasn't here for absolution. He was here because Cal Riggins had finally surfaced. A crumpled wanted poster, delivered by a ragged drifter weeks ago, showed Cal's sneering face, older, meaner, operating near the border. Red carried the guilt like a branding iron. Cal was his responsibility, his mistake. He needed to finish it. The next days were a purgatory. Red slept in the livery stable loft, ate sparingly, spoke little. He repaired the old pump at the abandoned church, surprising Widow Evans who lived nearby. He didn't ask for thanks, just nodded at her wary stare. One afternoon, Billy Cobb, the blacksmith's hot-headed son, fueled by stories of Red's past villainy, confronted him. "Murderer!" Billy spat, hand twitching near his own pistol, a shiny new peacemaker. "You got no right breathin' our air." Red just looked at him, weary. "Draw a boy, if you're to die today over something I did before you was born. Else, get out of my son." Billy flushed, hesitated under that ancient, cold gaze, and backed down, shamefaced. The town watched, the rigid hatred softening slightly into wary confusion. Then, the silence shattered. Hooves pounded into town, kicking up a storm of dust. For riders, hard-faced men with dusters and the look of hired wolves. And at their head, older but radiating vicious confidence, sat Cal Riggins. He reined in before the saloon, a cruel grin splitting his weathered face. "Well, I'll be hogtied, if it ain't old Red Harlow. Heard you crawled back to this dung heap?" Cal's voice boomed, shattering the fragile peace. "Come to finally pay for that bank job? Or maybe," his hand rested on his gun, "you come looking for me?" Red stepped into the street, the sun glinting off the tin star Sheriff Henderson had silently pressed into his hand moments before. "Both, Cal?" Red said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Time's up." The street emptied, townsfolk peering from windows and doorways. Henderson and Billy Cobb took positions flanking Red, shotguns leveled at Cal's men. "This is between us, Silas." Cal snarled, dismounting. "Always was." His hand flashed towards his holster with snake-like speed. Red moved with the economy of a man who'd danced this dance too many times. His draw wasn't the fastest, but it was precise, honed by years of survival and regret. 2 shots roared, echoing like thunderclaps off the false-fronted buildings. Cal's bullet kicked up dirt inches from Red's boot. Red's shot took Cal clean through the chest. The outlaw staggered, surprise etching his face, then crumpled into the dust. His men, seeing Henderson's unwavering shotgun and the grim determination on Billy's face, raised their hands slowly. The fight was over before it truly began. Red holstered his smoking Colt, looking down at the man who'd haunted his life. No triumph, just hollow finality. He walked to the sheriff, unpinned the borrowed tin star, and placed it back in Henderson's hand. Their eyes met, no forgiveness offered, none asked, but a grim understanding passed between them. Red turned towards his tired horse, the weight on his shoulders lighter, yet different. He hadn't found peace in Granite Springs, just an ending. As he rode out towards the setting sun, past the repaired church pump where Widow Evans stood watching silently, he didn't look back. The ghosts of Granite Springs, both his and the town's, could finally rest. He had miles to go, and maybe, just maybe, a different road ahead under the vast, uncaring sky. Chapter 2: The North Star Trail. The dust of Granite Springs faded behind Red Harlow like a bad dream, the borrowed weight of its ghosts settling into memory beneath the vast, indifferent sky. He pushed north, trading scorching desert for the pine-scented chill of the high country, following whispers of work and anonymity near the silver boom town of Argent Pass. Weeks bled into months, the rhythm of the trail a harsh bomb. He found rough shelter as a line shack caretaker for the sprawling Bar-X ranch, his only company the howl of wolves and the sighing wind through ancient timber. The solitude suited him, a penance paid in silence and simple tasks. Yet, peace remained elusive. News drifted up the mountain trails. Talk of Cal Riggins' gang splintering, vengeful remnants blaming Red for their downfall, whispers of a bounty hunter named the Stalker, asking questions with cold, hard cash. Red kept his head down, honing his skills not for the draw, but for survival, tracking game, mending fences, reading the subtle language of the wilderness. He crossed paths with Bjorn Olsen, a grizzled Swedish fur trader whose isolated cabin became a rare point of human contact. Bjorn, recognizing the quiet burden Red carried, offered gruff respect and traded coffee for fresh meat, their conversations sparse but solid. Red's fragile equilibrium shattered when a desperate rider stumbled into Bjorn's clearing, gasping about the Reaper. Silas Cobb, Billy's vengeful uncle from Granite Springs, driven mad by grief over Cal's death and Billy's perceived humiliation. Cobb, fueled by whiskey and rage, had gathered a posse of drifters and was terrorizing homesteaders along the North Star Trail, burning cabins and demanding information on the Red Devil. Worse, they'd taken young Ellie Mayhew, daughter of a widowed prospector, hostage near the treacherous Devil's Cleft Canyon. The news struck Red like a physical blow. His past, like a relentless shadow, had found him, threatening innocence he'd unwittingly drawn into his wake. He couldn't run. Saddling his weary horse, Red rode towards the rising smoke, the familiar, chilling weight of the Colt settling on his hip, not for vengeance, but for a reckoning he couldn't escape. Argent Pass glittered coldly in the distance, a promise of oblivion forever out of reach as he descended into the valley, ready to face the storm his past had summoned. The mountains watched, silent witnesses, as Red Harlow, the man seeking only empty horizons, rode back towards the fire. Chapter 3: The Devil's Due. Chapter 3: The acrid tang of burning timber clawed at Red Harlow's throat as he urged his weary horse down the North Star Trail, the distant plume of smoke near Devil's Cleft a grim beacon drawing him into the valley's tightening grip. Below, Silas Cobb's madness festered. The grieving uncle, fueled by cheap whiskey and burning hatred for the man he blamed for his nephew Billy's shame and Cal Riggins' death, had turned Reaper. His ragged posse of drifters and malcontents left a scar of charred homesteads and terrorized settlers across the once peaceful range. Reaching the canyon's rim at dusk, Red surveyed the hellish tableau. Cobb's men, shadows against the firelight of their camp nestled deep in the cleft's jagged throat, their raucous laughter echoing off the sheer walls. Below, near the churning river fed by glacial melt, huddled Ellie Mayhew, bound and terrified, guarded by a hulking brute. Red knew a direct assault was suicide. He waited for the deep mountain night, the cold seeping into his bones, his mind mapping the treacherous descent, loose scree, hidden crevices, the roar of the water masking his movement. Slipping down like a ghost, using the chaos of the river and the drunken carelessness of the centuries, he reached Ellie unseen. A swift, brutal takedown silenced her guard, the man's choked gasp lost in the canyon's roar. Cutting her bonds, Red pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes conveying the silent terror of their situation. Quiet as mice, he breathed, pushing her towards a narrow fissure in the rock wall, a hidden escape route upstream. But fate, ever cruel, intervened. A dislodged stone clattered down the slope. Shouts erupted from the camp. Torches flared, casting monstrous dancing shadows. They'd been seen. Red shoved Ellie into the fissure. "Run! Don't look back!" He commanded, turning to face the closing circle of torchlight and drawn guns, his back against the unforgiving rock. Bullets whined off stone as he returned fire from the scant cover of boulders near the riverbank, his Colt roaring defiance in the echoing chasm. Men fell, but more came, driven by Cobb's bellowed rage. Red felt the burn of a bullet graze his shoulder, the numbing cold of the river soaking his boots as he was driven back. Then Cobb emerged from the firelight, wild-eyed, a shotgun leveled. "Harlow! Face me, you yellow devil!" He screamed, spittle flying. Red stood exposed, the river at his back. The shotgun boomed. Red threw himself sideways, the buckshot tearing into the rock where he'd stood. His answering shot struck Cobb's leg, dropping the big man with a howl. As Cobb scrambled, mad with pain and fury, he lunged, not with his gun, but with a desperate shove, trying to send Red into the churning, icy torrent. They grappled on the slippery edge, the roar of the water deafening. Red, weakened by the graze and the cold, fought for purchase on the crumbling rock. Cobb, stronger but blinded by hate, heaved. With a final, desperate twist, Red broke the hold, but Cobb's momentum carried him forward. With a guttural cry lost in the river's thunder, Silas Cobb plunged over the edge, vanishing into the whitewater maelstrom below. The remaining posse, leaderless and stunned by Cobb's sudden, violent end, faltered. Their nerve broke. They melted back into the darkness of the cleft, abandoning their camp, they're captive, and they're dead. Red sagged against the rock, gasping, the icy spray stinging his face, the echoes of gunfire replaced by the river's relentless roar. Ellie emerged cautiously from the fissure, her eyes wide with shock and dawning relief. Wordlessly, he guided her back up the treacherous slope, away from the Devil's Cleft. Days later, near Argent Pass, Red left Ellie at the doorstep of a sturdy widow known for kindness. The Mayhew girl safe, her ordeal over. The widow offered him coffee, warmth, a place to rest. He declined with a quiet shake of his head. His path led away, always away. He rode out as the first snow began to dust the high peaks, a solitary figure swallowed by the vast, silent wilderness, the echoes of the canyon and the weight of unintended consequences clinging to him like the mountain cold. Argent Pass's distant lights glittered, a world forever separate from the road he walked alone. Chapter 4. The Price on the Wind. Chapter 4. Winter clamped its icy fist around the high country, transforming Red Harlow's solitary existence into a brutal struggle for survival. The wound from Cobb's bullet, a raw ache beneath layers of worn wool, protested every movement, sapping strength the dwindling game and deepening snow couldn't replenish. Argent Pass, the silver boomtown glittering like a false promise below the timberline, became less a choice and more a grim necessity. Medicine, proper food, maybe news of the bounty hunter, the stalker, he needed all three. Descending into the chaotic sprawl felt like entering another world. Crude log structures fought for space with hastily erected canvas tents, the air thick with the clamor of stamp mills, shouted deals, the clang of blacksmiths, and the pervasive stench of coal smoke, unwashed humanity and greed. Red kept his head down, the wide brim of his hat shadowing his face, the collar of his duster turned high. He moved like a ghost through the throng, procuring basic supplies and a small bottle of carbolic from a harried apothecary, his senses screaming alertness. He felt the eyes, not just the curious glances at a stranger, but the cold, calculating gaze he'd learned to dread. Spotting the telltale sign, a man leaning too casually against a post outside the crowded Silver Dollar Saloon, features sharp and impassive beneath a low-slung hat, posture coiled like a spring, his duster hanging just right for a swift cross-draw, confirmed it. The stalker, Silas Thorne, a name whispered with fear on wanted posters Red had glimpsed. Thorne hadn't seen him yet, his attention scanning the crowd methodically. Red melted into the flow of miners and drifters, using the cover of a passing or wagon to slip into the narrow, reeking alley beside the saloon. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of the fight, but from the exposure, the trap closing. He couldn't outrun Thorne in this maze, not weakened, not without sparking a bloodbath. A desperate plan formed. He backtracked silently, emerging not behind Thorne, but directly opposite him across the muddy street, stepping into clear view near the livery stable entrance. He didn't draw. He simply stood, exposed, meeting Thorne's suddenly focused, predatory stare across the chaotic thoroughfare. Recognition flared in the bounty hunter's eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by cold assessment. Red held the gaze, a silent challenge hanging in the frigid air. He saw Thorne's hand twitch near his coat. The street seemed to hold its breath for an agonizing second. Then, with deliberate slowness, Red tilted his head just slightly towards the shadowed alley mouth beside the saloon, a grim invitation. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He knew the alley was a potential death trap, a place for the kind of close, ugly work that could go either way. He also saw the cold resolve in Red's eyes, the utter lack of fear. Thorne was a hunter, not a brawler. His edge was surprise and distance. This direct confrontation, this silent dare into the unknown, tilted the odds. A muscle twitched in Thorne's jaw. He didn't move towards the alley. Instead, after a tense, silent exchange that spoke volumes, he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. His hand moved away from his coat. He turned deliberately and shouldered his way into the bustling saloon, disappearing into the smoky warmth and noise. Red didn't move for a full minute, the tension leaching slowly from his muscles, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He'd gambled his life on Thorne's calculated self-preservation and won. But Argent Pass was poison now. He secured his meager supplies, saddled his horse at the livery ignoring the curious stares, and rode out as the first heavy flakes of a new storm began to fall, leaving the false glitter and grasping hunger of the boomtown behind. He climbed back into the silent, white-shrouded embrace of the high peaks, the wound a dull throb, the cold a familiar companion. The bounty on his head remained, a constant shadow, but for now, the wind and snow were his only pursuers. He pushed deeper into the wilderness, seeking not sanctuary, but the simple, brutal honesty of survival, the vast, empty silence, the only promise the horizon ever kept. Chapter 5. The Weight of Winter. Chapter 5. The blizzard howled like a chorus of lost souls, burying the high passes under mountains of driven snow, forcing Red Harlow deeper into a frozen purgatory. Argent Pass was a fever dream fading behind the wideout, the wound in his shoulder a constant, gnawing companion that leached warmth and strength into the relentless cold. Days blurred into a numb struggle, forcing his staggering horse through drifts taller than a man, hacking ice from frozen springs, huddling in makeshift snow caves as the wind screamed its fury. Hunger became a sharp-toothed animal inside him, the meager supplies from Argent Pass long gone, game vanished or buried deep. Exhaustion pulled at him like lead weights, tempting him towards the deceptive peace of simply lying down in the soft, white embrace. Hallucinations began to flicker at the edge of his vision, the accusing eyes of the Granite Springs dead staring from snowdrifts, Silas Cobb's waterlogged face rising from an ice-covered stream, Cal Riggins' sneer twisting in the swirling snowflakes. They whispered his sins on the wind, a relentless jury condemning him to this frozen wasteland. One desperate afternoon, searching for firewood near a treacherous ice shelf, the ground betrayed him. A hidden layer of rotten snow collapsed beneath his boots. He plunged downward, a cascade of white engulfing him, tumbling into a shallow, snow-choked ravine. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent agony screaming through his injured shoulder. Dazed, half-buried, he lay staring up at the narrow strip of gray sky, the cold seeping into his bones with terrifying speed. This was it. The end he'd expected, yet fought for so long. Granite Springs, Cal, Cobb, Thorne, it all seemed distant now, meaningless against the vast, indifferent cold. He closed his eyes, ready to let the snow claim him. Then, cutting through the wind's mournful wail, came a sound, not a ghost, but the sharp, frantic barking of a dog. It pulled him back from the edge. Summoning reserves he didn't know he had, clawing against the suffocating snow, he dragged himself upwards. Cresting the rim, he saw it. A rough-hewn trapper's cabin, smoke weakly curling from a stone chimney, nearly invisible against the pines. A gaunt, wolf-like husky chained near the door barked incessantly, its eyes fixed on him. Red stumbled towards it, collapsing against the heavy door. It swung open under his weight. Inside, dim firelight revealed a single room, Spartan but lived in. An old man lay still on a cot near the hearth, eyes closed, face peaceful in death, frozen solid. Red understood. The dog had been calling for help that never came. He tended to the fire first, feeding it precious wood, the blessed heat beginning to thaw his frozen limbs. He found stores, jerked meat, beans, coarse flour. He fed the grateful husky, its frantic barking subsiding into whines. He buried the old trapper in the snow behind the cabin, speaking no words over the grave, simply acknowledging the grim trade. One life ended providing a slim chance for another. For days, Red rested, letting the fire and the food work their slow magic. The husky, whom he simply called Ghost, became a silent, watchful presence. In the quiet, the cabin's disrepair became apparent. A leaking roof, drafty chinks in the logs, a broken hinge on the door. The old trapper's tools hung neatly on the wall. Red picked up an axe. He didn't ride out when the storm finally broke, revealing a world dazzling white and silent under a cold sun. Instead, he patched the roof with split cedar shakes. He mixed mud and moss to seal the drafts. He fixed the door hinge. He worked methodically, the physical labor a strange counterpoint to the stillness within him. Ghost watched, tail thumping occasionally. It wasn't sanctuary Red found in that lonely cabin, nor peace. It was a fragile, hard-won truce. The ghosts still whispered, the weight of his past remained. But here, in the act of mending what was broken, of simply surviving the winter's brutal weight, he found a sliver of purpose as quiet and enduring as the deep snow outside. He looked out at the blinding expanse, axe resting on his shoulder, ghost beside him, and knew he would stay until the thaw. The road ahead could wait. Chapter 6. The Thaw and the Trail. Chapter 6. Winter's iron grip finally loosened. Under a strengthening sun, the snow retreated reluctantly, revealing patches of muddy earth and the first brave shoots of green. The relentless silence was replaced by the drip of melting ice, the chatter of returning birds, and the gurgle of swollen streams. Inside the repaired trapper's cabin, Red Harlow felt the shift deep in his bones. The wound was a dull memory. His strength returned through hard work and the cabin's meager stores. Ghost, the loyal husky, shadowed his every step, a silent companion in the quiet rhythm of their existence, chopping the last of the firewood, checking the traplines the old man left behind, sitting by the hearth as dusk painted the peaks in violet and gold. Red found a strange solace in the simple acts, mending his worn gear, watching Ghost chase snow hares in the clearing, the sheer, uncomplicated peace of the high country waking from its frozen sleep. He'd earned this fragile calm, paid for it in blood and cold and near death. Yet, as the trails cleared, the old restlessness stirred. He wasn't the old man who'd lived and died here. This wasn't his story's end. The bounty on his head hadn't vanished with the snow. Silas Thorne, the stalker, was still out there, a patient hunter. Staying meant inviting death to this quiet sanctuary, risking Ghost too. The decision crystallized one crisp morning. He stood at the trapper's grave marker, a simple cairn of stones, then walked back to the cabin. He packed his few belongings, his movements deliberate, Ghost watching intently, head cocked. He filled a sack with dried meat and hard biscuits, supplies for the dog, enough for weeks. He knelt, roughing the thick fur around Ghost's neck. "Guard the place, boy," he murmured, his voice thick with an unaccustomed emotion. "It's yours now." Ghost whined softly, pressing his head against Red's hand, understanding the finality in the gesture. Red saddled his horse, the familiar weight of the colt heavy on his hip, the worn leather creaking. He didn't look back as he rode out of the clearing, down the slope towards the emerging valley trails. Ghost stood sentinel at the cabin door, a gray shape against the weathered logs, watching until horse and rider vanished into the pine shadows. The high country air was sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth, the trail ahead winding south, away from Argent Pass's memory, towards lower valleys and the unknown. Red Harlow, the man marked by blood and snow, rode into the thaw, leaving behind the closest thing to peace he'd known, the ghost of a dog and a mended cabin fading into the vast, beautiful indifference of the mountains. The road was his only constant, the horizon his only destination, the weight of survival his familiar burden once more. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Coil. Chapter 7. Dust coated Red Harlow's tongue, thick and gritty, as he descended from the pine-scented heights into the arid expanse of the Serpentine Valley. The lush promise of the thaw faded, replaced by sun-baked scrubland, rattlesnakes basking on hot stones, and a horizon shimmering with heat haze. He rode towards the only sign of civilization, Serpent's Bend, a dusty cluster of adobe and timber clinging to the banks of a sluggish, muddy river. It felt like stepping onto a griddle. News traveled slower here, he hoped, a buffer against his past. He needed supplies, information on trails west, maybe a day's rest out of the punishing sun. The town seemed lethargic, oppressed by the heat. Men moved slowly under wide sombreros. Horses stood three-legged in scant shade. Yet, beneath the surface torpor, Red sensed a current of tension. Watchful eyes followed him from shadowed doorways, conversations hushed as he passed. He found the general store, its wooden floors creaking underfoot, the air thick with the smell of dry goods and gun oil. The proprietor, a gaunt man named Fletcher with eyes like chips of obsidian, took his coin for beans, coffee, and cartridges with minimal words, his gaze lingering a fraction too long on the worn colt at Red's hip. Outside, watering his horse at the communal trough, Red overheard two sun-leathered cowhands muttering about trouble up north, about a bounty hunter, asking sharp questions. Thorn. The name was a cold stone in his gut. He hadn't shaken the shadow. He sought the relative anonymity of the Gila saloon, its interior blessedly dim and marginally cooler. He took a corner table, back to the wall, nursing a warm beer, scanning the room, card players, a few dusty miners, a piano silent and dusty in the corner. His gaze snagged on a figure at the bar. Not Thorn. A woman. Maria Santos, the town knew her. Dark hair pulled back severely, posture rigid despite the heat, eyes holding a fierce, smoldering anger that cut through the haze. She was arguing in low, vehement Spanish with the bartender, gesturing towards a faded, wanted poster nailed crookedly to the wall. Not Red's, but a local bandit named Vasquez. The bartender shook his head, shrugging helplessly. Red caught the gist. Vasquez had raided her family's small ranch on the valley's edge, stolen cattle, killed her brother. The sheriff, it seemed, was conveniently busy. Maria slammed her empty glass down, the sound sharp in the quiet room, her frustration palpable. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Red's across the smoky space. There was no plea in them, only a raw, defiant despair, a reflection of the helpless rage he knew too well. He looked away first, the memory of Granite Springs, of Ellie Mayhew, a fresh ache. He couldn't get involved. Not here. Not now. He finished his beer, the taste suddenly sour. Stepping back into the blinding afternoon heat, he saw her mounting a tired-looking Pinto outside the sheriff's empty office. She sat tall, staring straight ahead, radiating a solitary, doomed determination. Red led his own horse towards the livery, the weight of his own isolation pressing down. He secured his meager supplies to the saddle. The smart move was to ride out immediately, vanish into the Badlands before Thorn's trail grew hot. He swung into the saddle, turning his horse not west, but south, following the river's curve towards the distant, hazy outline of the Santos Ranch. He told himself it was just a look, scouting the terrain. But as the adobe walls of Serpent's Bend shrank behind him, the valley heat pressing in like a fist, Red Harlow knew he was riding towards another man's storm, drawn by the echo of a woman's silent fury and the old, unshakable coil of responsibility he could never quite sever. The dust devils danced on the flats, serpentine and watchful. Chapter 8. Blood on the Adobe. Chapter 8. The Santos Ranch huddled low against the parched earth, a lonely fortress of sun-baked adobe surrounded by a struggling corral and the skeletal remains of burned-out sheds. Red Harlow reigned in a mile distant, using the scant cover of scrub brush and arroyos, Ghost's lessons in reading terrain etched into his movements. He saw the signs, fresh hoofprints churning the dust near the main house, the unnatural stillness broken only by the nervous whicker of a horse hidden behind the barn. Vasquez was here. Red dismounted, ground-tying his horse in a deep wash, and crept closer, the Colt a familiar weight in his hand. Peering over a low ridge, the scene unfolded. 3 of Vasquez's men, hard-faced and careless, lounging near a cook fire, their rifles propped nearby. Vasquez himself, a thick-necked brute with a silver-studded sombrero, stood in the dusty yard, yelling at Maria Santos, who stood defiantly on her porch, a worn shotgun held shakily but pointed squarely at his chest. Her younger brother, a boy of maybe 14, was pinned against the wall by another bandit, a knife at his throat. Vasquez's demands boomed, gold he claimed her father hid, cattle he wanted driven south. Maria spat her refusal. Red saw the bandit leader's face twist with rage, his hand dropping towards the pistol on his hip. Maria's finger tightened on the shotgun trigger. Red acted. His first shot wasn't at Vasquez, but at the bandit holding the boy. The man crumpled, the knife clattering to the dirt. Chaos erupted. Maria's shotgun roared, peppering the ground near Vasquez's boots as he dove for cover. Red's second shot took a rifleman reaching for his weapon clean through the shoulder. The third bandit scrambled for his gun. Red fired again, the bullet kicking dust at the man's feet, driving him back. Vasquez, snarling like a cornered wolf, fired wildly from behind a water trough, his shots going wide. Red shifted position, using the low adobe wall of a ruined outbuilding for cover. Maria dragged her brother inside, slamming the heavy door. Red and Vasquez traded shots across the yard, bullets chipping adobe, whining off stone. Red's aim was methodical, conserving ammunition, forcing Vasquez deeper into cover. He saw the bandit leader's panic rise as his men were down or pinned. Seizing a moment when Vasquez ducked to reload, Red sprinted low across the open ground, closing the distance. Vasquez looked up, eyes wide with terror, raising his pistol. Red fired once, a precise shot that struck Vasquez's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning away with a cry of pain. Before the bandit leader could react, Red was on him, the cold barrel of the Colt pressed against Vasquez's sweat-slicked temple. "Tell your men to drop their guns and ride out," Red growled, his voice low and lethal. "Now!" Vasquez, whimpering, bleeding, shouted the order in Spanish. The wounded rifleman and the cowering third man hesitated, then slowly complied, mounting their horses. Red kept the Colt steady. "You touch this place, this family again," he said, leaning close so only Vasquez could hear, "I'll find you. And next time I won't miss." He shoved Vasquez towards the remaining horses. The bandit leader scrambled into the saddle, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of pain and impotent fury. He spurred his horse savagely, his men following in a cloud of dust back towards the Badlands. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunpowder smoke. Red lowered his Colt, his breath coming hard. The ranch door creaked open. Maria stood there, the shotgun lowered, her eyes wide, looking from Red to the retreating bandits, then back to him, a tumult of relief, shock, and dawning realization warring in her gaze. She saw the hard lines of his face, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of burdens far heavier than Vasquez. He simply nodded, holstered his gun, and turned towards the wash where his horse waited. He didn't look back as he mounted up. He'd bought them time, maybe safety. It was all he could offer. As he rode east, skirting Serpent's Bend, the setting sun painting the desert in hues of blood and fire, he knew his brief respite was over. The shots fired at the Santos ranch would echo, a beacon for the patient hunter who tracked shadows. Silas Thorne's pursuit would be closing in, drawn by the sound of violence like a vulture to carrion. The road ahead promised only dust and danger. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Gulch. Chapter 9. The Ginsmoke hung thick and acrid in the narrow confines of Rattlesnake Gulch, stinging Red Harlow's eyes as he stood over Silas Thorne's still form. The bounty hunter's final, desperate shot had torn through the fabric of Red's duster sleeve, a searing line of fire along his bicep, before Red's answering bullet found its mark with brutal finality. The sudden silence after the thunderous exchange was deafening, broken only by the frantic scrambling of Thorne's terrified horse and the distant, alarmed cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon walls. Copper tang filled Red's mouth, blood from a split lip where Thorne's first, grazing shot had slammed his face against the rock. His ears rang, his breath came in ragged gasps that scraped his throat raw. He looked down at Thorne, the stalker, who'd hunted him across mountains and deserts, now just another dead man in the dust. No triumph stirred in Red's chest, only a profound, bone-deep weariness and the sharp, immediate pain of the fresh wound. He moved mechanically, retrieving Thorne's canteen and taking a long, desperate swallow of tepid water. He didn't search the body for bounty posters or coin. The dead man's gear held nothing he wanted. He simply pulled Thorne's horse from the brush, calming the skittish animal with rough, steady hands. He heaved the bounty hunter's body face down over the saddle, tying it securely with rawhide thongs. It was grim work, the weight heavy, the heat oppressive. Leading both horses, Red emerged from the shadowed gulch into the blinding afternoon sun of the open desert. He didn't head towards Rattlesnake Junction, the ramshackle mining camp clinging to the gulch's mouth. Instead, he skirted its edge, aiming for the marshal's outpost he'd spotted earlier, a lone, sun-bleached shack flying a faded flag. Word traveled fast in frightened towns. A small, nervous crowd had gathered outside the marshal's door as Red approached, trailing dust and death. Eyes widened at the sight of the body slung over the saddle, recognition dawning on a few hard faces. The marshal, a grizzled man named Cobb, no relation to Silas, Red noted grimly, stepped out, hand resting cautiously near his own pistol, his expression wary. Red stopped a dozen yards short, dropping the reins of Thorn's horse. Bounty hunter named Silas Thorn, Red stated flatly, his voice rough. Drew on me in the gulch. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer justification. He simply stood there, blood staining his sleeve, his face a mask of exhaustion and pain beneath the dust. Marshal Cobb eyed the body, then Red's wound, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. He knew Thorn's reputation, knew the kind of men he hunted. Finally, Cobb gave a curt nod. Seen his poster. Wanted for questionable methods back in Kansas territory. Reckon he found what he was looking for. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Red said nothing. He turned his own horse, ignoring the stares burning into his back, the whispers starting up behind him. He didn't look back at the body being untied, at the marshal's speculative gaze. He rode slowly out of Rattlesnake Junction, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. He found a shallow wash a mile out, dismounting stiffly. He built a small, smokeless fire, its feeble warmth a small defiance against the cooling night. Using precious water and a strip torn from his shirt, he cleaned the furrow along his arm, the grit biting into the raw flesh, his jaw clenched against the sting. He chewed on jerky, the taste of blood and dust still in his mouth, the image of Thorn falling replaying behind his eyes. The hunter was dead, a shadow lifted, yet no lightness came. The wound throbbed, a fresh scar to carry. The desert night closed in, vast and cold and silent, the stars indifferent pinpricks in the black velvet sky. Red Harlow sat by the tiny fire, alone with his pain and the relentless echo of the gunshots that seemed destined to follow him, mile after dusty mile, across the unforgiving land. Chapter 10. Dust to Dust. Chapter 10. The desert sun beat down relentlessly on the crumbling adobe way station, a forgotten speck on the edge of the vast, silent basin. Red Harlow sat in the scant shade offered by its crumbling wall, the wound on his arm a dull ache beneath a clean bandage, the split lip a scabbed memory. Thorn's shadow was gone, lifted by the echoes of gunfire in Rattlesnake Gulch, yet the emptiness it left felt vast and hollow, filled only by the wind's mournful song and the weight of miles stretching behind him. He'd ridden hard after leaving the marshal's post, pushing south and east, skirting towns, drawn by nothing more than the need to put distance between himself and the echoes of violence. He found himself here at this nameless ruin, its well dry, its corral sagging, a place where time itself seemed bleached and forgotten. He wasn't seeking sanctuary, he was simply stopping. The relentless flight, the years of looking over his shoulder, felt suddenly pointless. Thorn was the last hunter he knew of. Granite Springs, Cobb, Viscas, they were ghosts fading in the rearview mirror of his life. He built a small fire as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the desert chill creeping in. He ate the last of his jerky, sipped tepid water, the simplicity of the act grounding him. He thought of the trapper's cabin high in the snow, the quiet companionship of Ghost. He thought of Maria Santos' defiant eyes, Ellie Mayhew's relief. He thought of the blood spilled, his own and others, staining the dust from Granite Springs to this lonely ruin. The Colt lay heavy beside him, its familiar weight a burden now, a tool of a life he was weary of living. He picked it up, the worn metal cool in his hand. He didn't check the chambers. He simply walked out beyond the ruined wall, into the open basin under the first emerging stars. He dug a shallow hole in the hard-packed earth with his knife, the effort making his wounded arm protest. He placed the pistol inside, the weapon that had defined him, saved him, damned him. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly pushed the dirt back over it, burying the cold steel, the potential for violence, the symbol of the hunted man. He packed the earth down firmly. No marker, just desert reclaiming desert. He walked back to the dying fire, the weight on his hip gone, a strange lightness in its place, not of freedom, but of a choice finally made. He saddled his horse in the starlight, the only sound the creak of leather and the soft snort of the animal. He didn't know where the road led now, perhaps towards the faint glimmer of lights far to the south, perhaps deeper into the empty places. It didn't matter. He wasn't running anymore. Red Harlow, the man forged in blood and dust, mounted up and rode slowly away from the buried gun and the crumbling way station, a solitary figure swallowed by the immense, starlit silence of the desert, no longer pursued, simply moving forward into the unknown expanse of his own uncertain future. Chapter 11. The Shape of Peace. Chapter 11. The scent of damp earth and sagebrush gave way to wood smoke and baking bread as Red Harlow crested the final rise overlooking San Miguel. Nestled in a green valley fed by snowmelt streams, the town felt like a different world from the deserts and badlands, whitewashed adobe buildings with red tile roofs, orchards heavy with early fruit, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer a steady, productive rhythm. He guided his horse down the winding trail, the absence of the colt's weight still a strange void on his hip, a constant reminder of the choice made under the desert stars. He sought no grand welcome, only the possibility of quiet work. He found it at Ortega's livery, a large, clean barn smelling sweetly of hay and horses. Senor Ortega, a man whose face was a roadmap of deep lines etched by sun and kindness rather than violence, listened as Red offered only his hands and his knowledge of horses, omitting the weight of his past. Ortega's shrewd eyes saw the weariness, the scars, but also the steadiness. He offered a cot in the hayloft and steady pay for honest work. Red accepted. Days settled into a new rhythm, mending harnesses with careful stitches, soothing skittish mustangs with a low, calm voice, mucking stalls until his muscles ached with a satisfying fatigue utterly unlike the burn of a gunfight. He learned the names of the horses: Palomo, the gentle gray draft; Diablo, the fiery chestnut colt; Luna, the old mare with wise eyes. He spoke little to the townsfolk beyond polite nods, content with the horse's silent understanding. Yet, San Miguel worked its subtle magic. The rhythmic sweep of a broom across the livery's packed earth floor became a meditation. The shared midday meal of beans and tortillas with Ortega on a sun-drenched bench felt like a profound, unspoken connection. He watched families in the plaza, children chasing dogs, old men playing chess under the cottonwoods, scenes of ordinary life he'd only ever skirted like a ghost. One afternoon, delivering a repaired saddle to the cantina, he saw Maria Santos' face reflected in a dusty windowpane of the general store. It was just a trick of the light, a fleeting resemblance in a woman laughing with a basket of apples, but it stopped him cold. The echo of defiance, of loss, resonated deep within the fragile piece he was building. He felt the old instinct to move on, to flee before the past could taint this fragile sanctuary. He stood frozen on the boardwalk, the saddle heavy in his arms, the sounds of the bustling town suddenly distant. Then, Diablo's impatient whinny carried from the livery a sharp, present demand. Ortega's voice called out, asking about a loose shoe. The moment passed. He delivered the saddle, exchanged quiet words with the cantina owner, and walked back towards the familiar smells and sounds of Ortega's. The fear lingered, a shadow at the edge of the sunlight, but for now, the shape of peace, the weight of a harness, the trust in a horse's eye, the simple rhythm of work, held him steady. He picked up a hoof pick and bent to his task, the sun warm on his back, the valley cradling the town, holding its breath. Chapter 12. The Unmarked Trail. Chapter 12. The rhythm of San Miguel held Red Harlow in a gentle, if fragile, embrace. Days turned into weeks measured by the rasp of a curry comb, the satisfying thunk of a hammer shaping hot iron on Ortega's anvil, the soft chuff of horses content in their stalls. He learned the town's cadence, the morning bustle at the mercantile, the drowsy quiet of siesta, the evening murmur drifting from the cantina. He spoke more, simple words exchanged with Ortega about grain prices or a horse's temperament, a quiet buenos dias to the baker's wife who started leaving an extra sweet roll wrapped in cloth near the livery door. The void where the colt had rested became less strange, a lightness he started to trust. He mended fences for Senor Ruiz down the lane, the old woman pressing a jar of honey into his hands, her smile crinkling her eyes. He felt the tentative roots taking hold, not demanding deep soil, just a place to rest. One hot afternoon, sweat stinging his eyes as he wrestled a new shoe onto Diablo's skittish hoof. The livery doors creaked open, flooding the dusty interior with harsh sunlight. A lone rider stood silhouetted, travel-stained and weary. Red kept his head down, focused on the hoof braced between his knees, Diablo snorting nervously. The rider led his horse inside, the animal's hooves loud on the packed earth. Needs stabling. Good grain. Horse is spent. The voice was deeper, rougher than Red remembered, but instantly recognizable. Billy Cobb, the hot-headed boy from Granite Springs, now a man etched by hard miles, his youthful fire banked but not extinguished, the shiny peacemaker replaced by a well-worn colt hung low. Red's hands didn't falter on the shoe, but his blood ran cold. He felt Ortega pause in his sweeping, sensing the sudden, brittle stillness in the air. Billy moved into the shade, rubbing his horse's lathered neck, his gaze sweeping the livery. It passed over Ortega, over the stalls, then landed squarely on Red, bent over Diablo's hoof. Recognition flickered, then hardened into something sharp and complex. Surprise, yes, but also the old accusation, the memory of humiliation, and beneath it, perhaps, the shadow of his Uncle Silas Cobb's violent end. Red slowly finished clinching the nail, the metallic tink echoing loudly. He lowered Diablo's foot, straightened, wiping sweat and grime from his face with his sleeve, meeting Billy's stare across the dusty space. No words came. The past hung between them like a dust cloud, the bank robbery, Cal Riggins, the showdown in Granite Springs, Silas Cobb's rage and watery grave. Ortega watched silently, broom forgotten. Billy's hand hovered near his gun, knuckles white. Red didn't move towards a weapon he no longer carried. He simply held the gaze, his own expression unreadable, weathered by years Billy couldn't fathom, showing no challenge, only a weary acknowledgement of the history they shared. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken violence and the ghosts of Granite Springs. Billy's jaw clenched. He looked from Red's empty holster to his calloused hands, to the patient horse beside him, then back to Red's face, searching for the outlaw, finding only a stable hand marked by time and silence. Slowly, deliberately, Billy's hand moved away from his gun. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, but of a truce forged in mutual exhaustion and the understanding that some trails were better left unmarked. "Stall in the back's free," Ortega said quietly, breaking the spell, pointing with his chin. Billy led his horse past Red without another glance. Red picked up the rasp, turning back to Diablo's hoof, his hands steady, the familiar rhythm of work a lifeline. The storm hadn't broken. The past had walked in, looked him in the eye, and walked on. He blew dust from the hoof, the sound loud in the returning quiet. Outside, San Miguel hummed with ordinary life, oblivious. Red Harlow bent to his task, the shape of peace, though tested, holding firm beneath the warm New Mexico sun. Chapter 13. The Morning After. Chapter 13. The familiar pre-dawn quiet of San Miguel felt brittle, charged with the unspoken tension Billy Cobb's arrival had left hanging in the livery's dusty air. Red Harlow moved through his morning chores with mechanical precision, forking hay, filling water troughs, the rasp of the curry comb on Palomo's broad flank, his senses stretched taut as a bowstring. Every hoofbeat on the street outside, every creak of the livery door, sent a jolt of wary alertness through him. He expected the confrontation deferred, the eruption of Granite Springs ghosts demanding payment. Billy was staying at the cantina, his presence a low thrum in the town's quiet rhythm. Red saw him once, early, standing in the plaza's shade, staring towards the livery, his face unreadable. Ortega worked beside Red, his silence heavy with unasked questions, his usual easy chatter absent. He'd seen the look that passed between the two men, understood its dangerous weight. The sun climbed, baking the whitewashed walls. Red focused on the heat of the forge, shaping a new shoe for Senor Ruiz's plow horse. The rhythmic hammer blows a desperate anchor against the churning thoughts. He remembered Billy's youthful fury, the shiny peacemaker, the humiliation etched on his face years ago. He remembered Silas Cobb's mad rage, the icy plunge into the devil's cleft. Was Billy here for blood, for answers, or simply passing through? The uncertainty was its own kind of torment. Midday found Red oiling harnesses in the deep shade of the livery's rear stall, the smell of leather and linseed thick. He heard the deliberate footsteps on the packed earth floor before he saw the shadow fall across his work. Billy Cobb stood there, hat in hand, his face harder than Red remembered, the lines deeper, but the fire in his eyes banked, replaced by a weary, haunted look. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood, looking at Red, then at the worn leather in Red's hands, the careful work. "Heard tell my uncle died chasin' you," Billy said, his voice rough, devoid of its old bluster. Red didn't look up, running the oil rag along a strap. "He died chasin' a ghost, Billy. His own." The silence stretched. Billy shifted his weight. They said he went mad. Burning the homesteads. The girl. Red met his gaze then. He did. The raw admission hung in the air. Billy looked down, scuffing his boot in the dirt. The anger Red expected didn't flare. Instead, Billy's shoulders slumped slightly. Always was a hard man. Got harder after Granite Springs. He looked back at Red, a flicker of the old accusation surfacing, then fading. "You just working here now?" Red nodded slowly. "Yeah." Billy absorbed this, his eyes sweeping the tidy livery, the patient horses, Ortega sweeping the far aisle. He took a deep breath, the air whistling slightly through his nose. Reckon some trails are better left cold," he said finally, echoing his silent truce of the day before, but now giving it voice. He jammed his hat back on his head. "Got miles to go." He turned and walked out, not towards the cantina, but towards the corral where his own horse was tethered. Red watched him go, the coiled tension in his gut slowly unraveling, leaving a strange emptiness. He heard Billy saddling up, the soft clink of tack, then the fading drumbeat of hooves heading east out of the valley, not west towards Granite Springs. Ortega appeared beside Red, leaning on his broom, watching the dust settle on the empty road. "Some burdens," the old man said quietly, his voice like dry leaves, "ain't meant for others to carry, nor for us to keep offering." He gave Red a long, knowing look, then went back to his sweeping. Red picked up the oil rag again, the leather smooth beneath his fingers. The ghost of Billy Cobb, of Granite Springs, had ridden in, spoken its piece, and ridden out. The silence that filled the livery now felt different, deeper, cleaner, the morning after quiet after a storm has passed. He finished the harness, the rhythmic task no longer a shield, but simply work. Outside, San Miguel basked in the afternoon sun, the ordinary sounds of life resuming undisturbed. Red Harlow breathed in the scent of hay and leather, the weight of the past momentarily lifted, leaving only the solid, sun-warmed earth beneath his boots and the unmarked path of the present stretching ahead. Chapter 14. The Rustler's Moon. Chapter 14. The brittle tension that followed Billy Cobb dissolved like morning mist under the strengthening New Mexico sun. San Miguel settled back into its deep, contented rhythm, the scrape of Red Harlow's shovel in the corral, the rhythmic ring of Ortega's hammer, the low murmur of townsfolk in the plaza becoming the steady heartbeat of his days. He mended fences for old Senora Ruiz, repaired a stubborn wagon wheel for the mercantile owner, his calloused hands finding purpose in creation, not destruction. The absence of the colt felt less like a missing limb and more like shedding heavy armor. He ate simple meals with Ortega, the silence between them comfortable, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the soft stamp of horses in their stalls. Trust, slow and quiet as a desert bloom, began to unfurl. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in fiery streaks, a rider galloped into town, lathered horse screaming exhaustion. It was young Miguel, the Ruiz boy, his face pale, voice cracking. Rustlers at the North Valley herd. 4, maybe 5 men cut the fence, driving them towards Coyote Wash. Panic rippled through the gathered crowd. The North Valley herd was shared by several small ranchers, their livelihood. The town's 2 aging deputies exchanged grim looks. They were no match for hardened rustlers. Men looked towards the saloon, hoping for drifters willing to fight, but found only nervous faces. Red felt the old instincts surge, assessing terrain, numbers, tactics. He saw Ortega's gaze rest on him, not demanding, simply acknowledging the skills Red possessed. The weight of belonging pressed down, heavier than any gun. He couldn't stand by. "Miguel," Red said, his voice cutting through the panic, calm and low. "The wash narrows near the old salt lick, steep sides. Can you get there ahead? Scatter brush, anything noisy, across the entrance." Miguel nodded, wide-eyed. Red turned to the deputies. "Block the south end of the wash with your wagon, loud and obvious. Make them think it's the main force." He looked at the gathered men, farmers and shopkeepers holding shotguns and ancient rifles. The rest with high ground, east rim. Stay hidden. Fire over their heads when they're funneled in. Make noise, lots of it. Don't shoot to kill unless shot at. No one questioned his plan. The quiet authority in his voice cut through fear. They moved fast. Red led the townsmen on a hard scramble up the rocky eastern slope overlooking Coyote Wash, the scent of sage and dust sharp in the cooling air. Below, the nervous lowing of the stolen herd echoed in the deepening twilight. He positioned the men behind rocks and scrub, whispering final instructions. Minutes later, the rustlers appeared, driving the cattle hard into the narrowing wash. Miguel's noisy barrier at the entrance startled them, bunching the herd. Then the deputy's wagon rattled into view at the far end, lanterns swinging wildly, shouts echoing. The rustlers, confused, trapped, reined in their horses, looking wildly between the two blockades. Red gave a sharp whistle. A ragged volley erupted from the rim. Shotgun blasts, rifle cracks, the sharp zing of bullets cutting air high above the rustlers' heads. The noise was deafening in the confined space, multiplied by echoes. Cattle stampeded in panic, horses reared. The rustlers, expecting a fight, were met with terrifying, unseen chaos. One fired wildly towards the rim. A shotgun blast from a townsman near Red kicked dust at the shooter's feet. "Drop your guns." Red's voice boomed, amplified by the wash. "Next shot ain't warning." The rustlers froze, surrounded by noise, blinded by the deputies' lanterns, unable to pinpoint their attackers on the dark rim. One by one, pistols thudded into the dust. Hands went up. The deputies moved in cautiously, covering them as the townsmen scrambled down, whooping with nervous relief. No one was dead. The herd, though spooked, was largely recovered. Red stood on the rim, watching the lantern light play on the captured men's faces below, not hardened killers, just desperate, scared fools. He felt no urge to descend, no need for recognition. The moon rose, bathing the valley in silver light. As the townsmen led the rustlers and the herd back towards San Miguel, voices loud with triumph, Red hung back. Ortega materialized beside him in the moonlight, silent for a long moment. He didn't offer praise. He simply placed a weathered hand on Red's shoulder, a solid, grounding weight. They walked back together in the quiet night, the scent of sage and dust and cooled earth around them, the distant sounds of the returning town a low hum on the breeze. The weight of belonging settled deeper, not as a burden, but as a foundation, solid as the earth beneath his worn boots. Chapter 15. The Shape of Home. Chapter 15. Seasons turned in the valley of San Miguel. The scorching summer's sun mellowed into the golden light of autumn, painting the cottonwoods in fiery hues before winter's brief chill dusted the surrounding peaks white, then gave way once more to the gentle green promise of spring. Red Harlow's life settled into the deep, quiet grooves of the land and the livery. The wary glances from townsfolk softened into nods of acknowledgement, then greetings. He became simply Red, the man who fixed harnesses with patient skill, who gentled the wildest colt, who'd stood with them under the rustler's moon. The absence of the colt was no longer noted. It belonged to the desert, buried with the man he'd been. He shared meals with Ortega, the silence between them now rich with understanding, broken by stories of horses long gone or the old man's tales of the valley before the railroad whispered through. He accepted Senor Ruiz's honey, helped young Miguel mend his first saddle, felt a quiet pride when Diablo, the once skittish colt, nuzzled his hand without flinch. One crisp spring morning, Ortega didn't meet him at the forge. Red found him sitting on the sun-warmed bench outside the livery doors, a worn wooden box on his lap. his face peaceful but etched with a deeper weariness than usual. Ortega patted the space beside him. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, lay an old, beautifully maintained Colt single-action army, its blued steel gleaming, the walnut grips worn smooth by careful hands, not violence. "Belonged to my father," Ortega said, his voice soft. "He was a lawman down in Sonora. Good man. Never drew it in anger, just showed it. Said respect was better worn than fear." He closed the box and pressed it into Red's hands. "Place needs protectin', sometimes, Red. Not just from rustlers. From the world. Protect it like he did. With respect." Red felt the weight not just of the gun, but of the profound trust offered. It wasn't a burden, but a belonging. He didn't strap it on. He placed the box carefully on the shelf above his cot in the hayloft, a symbol of the life he guarded, not the one he'd fled. That evening, as the setting sun bathed the whitewashed buildings in rose and gold, Red walked through the quiet plaza. Children laughed chasing fireflies. Old men argued good-naturedly over chess. The scent of wood smoke and roasting chilies hung in the air. He stopped near the central well, listening to the familiar sounds, Ortega's soft whistling from the livery, the distant lowing of cattle, the murmur of families behind lit windows. He looked towards the eastern pass, the road he'd ridden in on, a faint scar on the horizon. There was no pull, no restless urge to walk its dusty length. The vast silence he'd once sought wasn't out there beyond the mountains anymore. It was here, in the warm weight of the evening air, in the trust of a horse's soft nicker, in the quiet respect of a town that knew his hands were for building, not breaking. Red Harlow took a deep breath, the scent of earth and sage and home filling his lungs. He turned his back on the pass, walking not towards an unknown horizon, but towards the warm light spilling from Ortega's open door, the shape of his piece finally complete, rooted deep in the good earth of the valley he'd chosen. Chapter 16. The Circle Closed. Chapter 16. The rhythm of San Miguel, once a fragile melody, had become the steady drumbeat of Red Harlow's life. Years flowed like the snowmelt streams, etching deeper lines around his eyes, lines born more from sun and quiet laughter than the harsh etchings of his past. He was simply Red now, woven into the valley's fabric, the steady hand at Ortega's livery, the patient teacher showing young Miguel the finer points of forging a perfect shoe, the quiet presence who could calm a spooked horse with a murmur and whose word carried weight in town meetings held under the ancient cottonwood. The boxed Colt rested on its shelf, a silent testament to trust, untouched but understood. One balmy summer evening, the scent of roasting chilies and pinyon smoke thick in the air, a familiar dust cloud appeared on the eastern pass. Not a threatening stampede, but a single rider leading a sturdy pack mule. As the figure drew closer, resolve hardening into weary lines, yet softened by time, a collective murmur rippled through the plaza. Maria Santos. The fierce defiance Red remembered was tempered now by a deep, enduring sorrow, but also a quiet strength. She dismounted stiffly before the cantina, her gaze sweeping the peaceful scene, children playing, families gathering, the soft strum of a guitar drifting on the breeze. Her eyes found Red, standing near the livery doors, Ortega beside him. Recognition flared, followed by a profound, silent understanding that passed between them, acknowledging the desert fury, the blood spilled, the debt paid in full long ago. No words were needed for the past. Maria spoke of the present, drought gripping the southern ranges, her small herd dwindling, the desperate search for greener pastures whispered about in distant towns. San Miguel, with its reliable streams, was her last hope. A quiet council formed under the cottonwood that night, Ortega, the ranchers, Red. There was no hesitation, only the practical kindness of people who understood the land's harshness. Pasture was offered on the high meadows, shared tools, a spare room at Senora Ruiz's. Red found himself guiding Maria's small, weary herd towards the lush grass the next morning, the valley stretching green and welcoming below. He worked beside her, mending the temporary corral fence on the high meadow, the silence comfortable, filled only by the lowing of contented cattle and the cry of hawks circling overhead. He saw the tension slowly ease from her shoulders, replaced by a fragile hope as she watched her animals graze. Later, sharing water from his canteen, their hands brushed, a simple, unplanned contact. He saw not the defiant fury of Serpent's Bend, nor the raw despair, but a woman shaped by loss and resilience, finding a tentative foothold in this sanctuary just as he had. That evening, as dusk painted the peaks in violet and gold, Red stood with Ortega on the livery porch. Maria sat with Senor Ruiz on the plaza bench, their heads bent in quiet conversation, the first genuine smile Red had seen on her face touching her lips. Ortega offered his pipe, the sweet tobacco scent mingling with the evening air. "Circle closes sometimes, Red," the old man said softly, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "Not always how we expect." Red looked out at the peaceful valley, the lights beginning to twinkle in the adobe homes, the soft sounds of community, the figure of Maria finding rest. The ghosts were silent. The road that once stretched endlessly towards an empty horizon ended here, in the good earth, the trusted steel resting in its box, and the quiet certainty that San Miguel wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was the place he was meant to be, the circle finally, fully closed. He took the pipe, the warmth in his chest mirroring the warmth of the valley cradled in the gathering night. Chapter 17, The Keeper's Fire. Chapter 17, Time, measured in the turning of seasons and the steady rhythm of the forge, flowed through San Miguel like the lifeblood of the valley. Red Harlow, once a specter on the horizon, became as rooted as the ancient cottonwoods shading the plaza. His hair carried more silver, his movements perhaps a fraction slower, but the quiet strength in his hands, gentling horses or shaping iron, remained. He was Red, the liveryman, the steady presence, the keeper of stories whispered now only in the flickering light of the forge or shared over simple meals with Maria Santos, whose fierce spirit had softened into a resilient warmth beside him. They built a life, not with grand declarations, but with shared tasks, tending the small herd she'd rebuilt on the high meadows, repairing fences after winter storms, sitting in comfortable silence on Ortega's porch as dusk settled, watching the fireflies dance. The old man, Ortega, grew frail, his steps slower, his time spent more often on the sun-warmed bench, a worn blanket over his knees, watching Red work with eyes full of pride and peace. One crisp autumn morning, Ortega didn't rise. He passed quietly in his sleep, his face serene, the lines of a long, mostly gentle life etched deep. The valley mourned. Red, with Maria's quiet support beside him, built the coffin with seasoned oak, carving Ortega's name with careful hands. They buried him on a sun-drenched slope overlooking the livery and the town he'd loved, the entire valley gathering to sing old hymns under the vast, blue sky. After the last amen faded, the mayor, Senor Ruiz, and the ranchers approached Red. No vote was taken. The answer lived in their eyes. The livery, the forge, the heart of San Miguel's working life, passed to Red. He accepted the heavy ring of keys, not as a burden, but as the deepest form of belonging, the final anchor cast. That evening, alone in the familiar space scented with hay and leather and old iron, Red lit the forge fire. Not for work, but for light. He took down the wooden box from its shelf. Opening it, he lifted Ortega's father's Colt, the blued steel cool and gleaming. He held it for a long moment, feeling its balanced weight, the history of respectful protection it embodied. He didn't strap it on. He placed it carefully back in its velvet nest, closed the box, and returned it to the shelf. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows. He walked to the wide-open doors, looking out at the plaza bathed in moonlight. Children's laughter echoed faintly. A horse whickered softly in its stall. Maria stepped into the circle of light from the forge, carrying 2 steaming mugs. She joined him, handing one over, her shoulder lightly touching his arm as they stood gazing at their town, their home. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the valley's breath, the weight of trust fulfilled, the gentle embers of a life built from ashes, and the enduring warmth of the keeper's fire, burning steady and sure against the quiet night. Chapter 18, The Last Sunrise. Chapter 18, Decades flowed like the gentle stream through San Miguel, carving deeper lines on Red Harlow's face, silvering his hair like the peaks in winter, but never dimming the quiet light in his eyes. He moved through the rhythms of the valley, the ring of the forge where young Miguel, now a master blacksmith himself, shaped iron with the same patient skill Red had taught him. The familiar scent of hay and horses in the livery he still tended, its doors always open, the warm weight of Maria's hand in his as they walked the twilight plaza, watching fireflies dance where children, grandchildren of those he'd known, now played. The past was a faded photograph, its sharp edges softened by time, its ghosts laid finally, truly, to rest in the good earth of the valley. He never wore the Colt. It remained in its velvet-lined box, a symbol revered but retired, speaking of protection earned through peace, not drawn steel. One crisp autumn morning, dawn painting the eastern peaks in rose and gold, red rose as always. He fed the horses in the pre-dawn quiet, their soft knickers a familiar comfort. He walked slowly to the forge, its cold hearth waiting. He didn't light it. Instead, he took the wooden box from its shelf. He carried it outside, Maria joining him silently on the porch, her own hair silver, her gaze steady and full of a lifetime's shared understanding. Together, they walked past the waking town, past the ancient cottonwood, up the sun-dappled slope to where Ortega rested beneath a simple stone. Red knelt, the earth cool beneath his hands. With careful, deliberate movements, he dug a small, deep hole beside the old man who had offered him trust, a home, and a different path. He placed the box within, the unblemished Colt resting forever beside the keeper of its history. He covered it, patting the earth smooth, a final act of guardianship, releasing the last tangible echo of the man he'd once been. He stood, Maria's hand finding his. Below, San Miguel stirred, smoke curling from chimneys, Miguel firing his forge, the clang of hammer on anvil a bright, enduring song, children's laughter echoing in the clear air. The valley breathed, vibrant, alive, a testament to the life built, the peace nurtured, the circle complete. Red Harlow looked out over it all, the man who arrived as a shadow now standing firmly in the warm light of belonging. He squeezed Maria's hand, a silent communication forged over countless sunrises. There were no more trails to ride, no horizons to chase. He was home. The last sunrise found him not as an outlaw, a wanderer, or a warrior, but simply as Red, husband, friend, keeper of the flame, his legacy written not in bullet scars, but in the enduring peace of the valley and the steady heartbeat of San Miguel, carrying on beneath the vast, benevolent sky. The story ends here, in the quiet warmth of a life fully lived. The last trail ended not in dust, but in deep, enduring roots.